Gentlemen, let's broaden our minds. Lawrence?
Welcome to the Crafter's Corner, the live stream that's all about taking a break.
The cultists of Great Cthulhu often worship him through depraved and orgiastic voodoo rituals, performed as an indescribably grotesque mask of naked human abnormality, braying, bellowing, and writhing in the moonlight.
That's what we should do.
To make time for creativity and crafting. Whether you're a wargamer, game master, RPG player, model maker, cosplayer, costumer, or creative crafter of any kind, you're welcome here.
And I always confuse Monet and Manet. Now, which one married his mistress?
Monet.
Right, and then Manet had syphilis.
They also painted occasionally.
Maybe you have a few hundred, or maybe a few thousand unpainted miniatures laying around your house. Now would be a great time to pick them up, grab a paintbrush, and a few bottles of paint. Let's get those miniatures painted, whether you just need that one perfectly painted miniature for your D&D character, a band of orcs to pit against your PCs, a custom warband for Frostgrave or Mordheim, or even a whole new Warhammer army. Let's get to work on it. And you know what? Now would also be a great time for a glass of your favorite beverage to enjoy while we work.
Captain Kirk, I thought Romulan ale was illegal.
One of the advantages of being 1,000 light years from Federation headquarters.
Or maybe you need some terrain for your table. No problem. Now would be a great time for cutting foam, flocking bases, scratch building something cool, and just painting something awesome. Not only will we have a good time here, but it just might make your next game night that much better.
To do this, we are going to need a greenstone idol of Cthulhu.
Yes, Ben, you may speak.
I can make it. I majored in art for a semester.
That's great, Ben. No special skills are necessary here, as long as we're having fun. That's all that matters. Maybe you've got a model that you want to build. Maybe there's a model of the Starship Enterprise or of a Klingon warbird that's still sitting in its box. Well, now would be a great time to open it up and see what it would take to get it done. Have you poured your drink yet?
What's that? This, my friend, is a pint. It comes in pints? Oh. I can get you one.
What about cosplay? Need some extra time to work on your next great costume? Now is the time to break out the sewing machine, the fabric, the thread, crafting foam, and maybe even some Warbla. That all sounds great to me. Let's see what we can create.
Spider.
So grab your paints, brushes, thread, crafting foam, fabric, or whatever it might be that you need to create what you want to have for your next game session or your next convention, or maybe just what you need to have a little bit of fun tonight doing something creative.
I now do what other people only dream. I make art until someone dies. See? I am the world's first fully functioning homicidal artist.
Come on in for a bit of fellowship and camaraderie, because now it's time for the Crafter's Corner. Let's make something great.
My transformation into a deep one has finally begun. Father Dagon be praised.
Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to another Crafter's Corner. It's so great to have you here. I really am looking forward tonight because I think we have a great topic for discussion and also have an opportunity to get lots more crafting done. I've been working on that. Hey, last night I continued to work a bit on my Elven Archers here for the Mage of the Mirror craft pack. I don't think they've come out quite as great as I would have liked. I think they're probably about middle of the road for this particular group of miniatures, but hey, that's enough. That's enough. I think I might have changed up the color. In retrospect, I would probably change up the color scheme a little bit, but oh well. Like I said, my purpose here is to get to tabletop quality miniatures for an entire box full of miniatures. So, not everything's gonna be perfect. I do really like how the doors have come out, though. I'm really impressed with how the doors have come out. So those are successful. I do like the throne as well. It's a very simple paint job, but I think it works I did screw up the weapons rack. So I'm going to have to try to fix the weapons rack because especially like over here with the yellow, I kind of screwed it up. So I'm going to try to fix that up. But nonetheless, this is basically what I've got left as far as all of the miniatures for the Hero Quest Mage and the Mirror Quest pack that I want to get done because I'm trying to get these done so that we can move on to doing board game streaming with, for instance, dinner and a board game, streaming that. I want to play dinner and a board game with painted miniatures. So whatever. Let's see who is here with us tonight. Hey, Jason Carham says first. All right. So Jason is here. Welcome. Jason was the first one here. Jason says, before this even begins, I would like to say that orcs as universally evil as fine to my mind, because they are not humans or a stand-in for any particular group of humans. So I edited together all of the commentary on orcs so we can have the conversation on orcs, orcishness, and evil tonight. So I'm looking forward to all kinds of conversation with people here in the chat as we go forward and as we are making these things. Hey, Jason, good evening. JDM says, good evening. Good to see you. Good to see you. Jason says, tonight's craft is creating dungeon maps via Dungeon Draft. It sounds like an excellent project tonight. Doesn't always have to be something physical. You can completely be doing something digital on, for instance, on Dungeon Craft. Sounds great. Jason Karam says, as for the nature of evil, I think of it as the inverse of goodness, which Dr. Peterson has said something like is the desire that everything should prosper, if I recall correctly. So let me say that again. So as for the nature of evil, I think it is as the inverse of goodness, which Dr. Peterson has said is something like the desire that everything should prosper, if I recall correctly. So the inverse of the desire for everything to prosper would be evil. Very interesting, Jason. Very interesting. I appreciate the commentary. Nico says the inverse of the center of the circle is its perimeter, which is an infinite amount of points. It doesn't work like that. Jason says, if you insist on mapping it as the concept as a circle, I guess I see it as a continuum. Jason says, a line segment with one end point being irredeemably evil and with the other being an absolute goodness and benevolence. So, these topics have produced some absolutely fantastic conversations here on the channel. We've been talking about, we did a series on the morning grind on the Book of Vile Darkness. If you haven't been part of that, you should definitely look that up and watch that on a replay. That we went through the Book of Vile Darkness. We went through the Book of Erotic Fantasy. We also went through, or in the process of going through Dark Sun. And these kinds of topics have been things that people have really been interested in talking about in the comments. And I have really been interested in talking about as well. Nico says, is there only one opposite to the desire that everything should prosper? See the kinds of conversations we have? I think these are important ones to have. Hey, Conv1, I'm painting NPCs tonight. Good to see you. Yes, all right, wonderful, excellent. Jason Carm says, if mapped as a continuum, yes. Omnibenevolence and omnibenevolence. Oh, omnibenevolence. Great word there. Let's see. Oh my God. K Con says I printed about 50 villagers that now need to pay. That's why I'm not printing things yet, because I would sit here and print tons of plastic, and I already have tons of plastic that need painting. Jason says I really need to get into 3D printing, if only to make 3D sculpts into physical things. Hey, James Bacon. Good morning, or good evening. No, good evening, James Bacon. Well, oh my God, been up since 3 a.m. Well, hang with us while you can. It'll be a good conversation, or watch on the replay. Hey, Mike. Good evening, Jay and Jappards. James Bacon says, I agree with Jason. I am okay with an orc or any fantasy race that has as that matter being predisposed toward evil. K. Convet says, evil and goodness are often in the eye of the beholder. In the anime Space Battle Yamato Star Battles, Deslik was saving his people from certain death, though it would result in the death of Earth. I don't know that that anime. I'm not well versed in anime. Jay says, these philosophical arguments are too complex for me, or conversations. Well, we'll just see. Here we go. Oh, Nico, thank you very much for the super chat. Thank you so much for the super chat, Nico. I really appreciate it. Nico says, hi, Heath, as a new viewer here. So I binged your orc videos, and your instinct is in a good place, but so far I haven't seen very good responses. There's still a mountain of things for you to discover. Well, thank you. I did see that you had been putting some comments on some of the videos that I think we'll actually rewatch today. So I don't think enough people have watched those videos, but I think they have been good ones. But I did see that you would put a lot of commentary there. So I think there is a lot more to go into. I agree with you. I'm very interested. There's the conversation itself, and then there's the conversation about what it says about what the state of our society is and what other people want to talk about when we talk about orcs and orcishness. And that does come up in even some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. When we talk about that, what do people want to talk about? They often don't actually want to talk about evil. They don't actually want to talk about evil. So I think that there is a lot more to talk about and discover as we are going forward with this topic. I'm very interested in this topic. But like I said, personally, if you're just wondering where I come from, I am not personally a religious individual, although I do come out of the tradition, the Southern Protestant religious tradition, Christian tradition here in the United States. My grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher. We attended both Baptist, Methodist, and Episcopal churches here when I was growing up. Now I am no longer religious, but I still have that influence from my childhood and so forth. And I think it's an extremely important discussion to consider. Oh, Jay says, "Damn, Nico, wow." Well, Joseph Carter, we are going to be, I strung together and edited together a bunch of them for this particular conversation tonight. So you'll probably be able to catch up with a bunch of it tonight. Hello, everyone. Hello. Let's see. No, I don't know much about Babylon 5. Babylon 5 also covered similar ideas while the shadows are presented evil through the series. But at the end, you realize they're actually trying to advance the lesser races. Oh, James says, I was previously ordained. No more, though. Interesting. JDM says, I agree with the subjectivity of evil and the redeemability of orcs in the abstract, but I keep them evil and monstrous in my games so the players don't have to worry about killing the bad guys. I think there's something to be said about that. I'm not sure if I brought that up in the material that we're going to be playing tonight, but, when I said that if you look over the cliff and you look down below and you see that if you're playing a role-playing game and you see that there are a bunch of orcs attacking elves, to me, that's often kind of the game master trying to tell you, okay, well, join the elves in the fight against the orcs. We're not trying to have some major conversation about, and then, if the heroes do leap down or the PCs do leap down to help the orcs against the elves, is this the kind of game where the game master would go, ha-ha, how about that? These orcs were actually benevolent and good, and these elves were actually evil and terrible, and you have just helped slaughter the creatures of good, or something like that. Like, is that something that's going to be present in this game, or are those tropes something that's trying to tell you something about something metaphysical about the world, but in physical terms, so that you can just skip that and don't have to have that kind of conversation at the table? Now, some people may want to have that conversation at the table. But if you wanted to have that conversation at the table, personally, I would do that with all humans. Okay, everything's human. But as soon as you start having elves, orcs, and things like that, to me, that's starting to have a physical representation of some kind of metaphysical truth. James says, Christian belief still fascinates me, though. Tomocrat says, the concept of evil is interesting as a subject not fully explored. And we don't, and I think there's an argument that we're not fully exploring it in today's world. And I believe it may have been James. It may have been James who was talking about our relationship with evil, society's relationship with evil hasn't changed, but our perception of evil has. And so what is our perception of evil? How is our perception of evil changed? All right. Jay says, the thing about subjective evil is that it gets confusing. It can certainly get confusing, especially if you're just trying to have like a 3-hour game or something like that. That you may not have enough time to have but I mean, you might, but it may not be your desire to spend the time having a serious conversation about subjectivity and the nature of evil and stuff like that. JDM says, yes, for me, it's a monster killing and dungeon exploration game. I don't run games where the point is a philosophical or theological exercise in duality. Film and literature are different animals. All right, well, let's get into this. Like I said, what I did is I edited together a bunch of videos specifically on the nature of orcs and orcishness for tonight's discussion. So I'm going to start playing that while I'm going to see, man, who knows? It sure would be great. Oh, this is the Elf Queen Sinestra right here. And I got to spend a little bit more. I want to spend a little bit more time on her. I don't like the way the front of her robes are coming out. But if it would be great if I could get this done, because I really would like to start streaming some board games soon. But I want to get their miniatures painted. All right, let me go over here and get this video started so we can have this conversation. We're going to be taking a look at the history of the development of Orcs and Orcishness since J.R.R. Tolkien. We already took a look at Tolkien. Oh, wait. Oh, my God. I've got to have my ear headphones on. Forgot about that. In a previous video, from here on out, rather than studying each and I'm hearing through here. Let me make sure that I've got the audio going through the right. Okay, I think I do. You should be able to hear this. Okay, now, okay, Tomocrat says, okay, echo, but it's because I just put on my headphones. So, all right, let's try this again. Maybe we are now good. Individual property or I'm Heath, and in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the history of the development of Orcs and Orcishness since J.R.R. Tolkien. We already took a look at Tolkien in detail in a previous video, but from here on out, rather than studying each individual property or franchise individually and in isolation, I think the best way to go forward at looking at this material is in chronological order so that we can understand what influence some works will have on another as we go forward in time. So what we'll be doing is starting with The Hobbit for the sake of completeness, but then as we start to move past Tolkien, I'll start to provide more commentary and notes on what I think are significant parts or features. Well, I need to stop here because August has put in a super chat here. Thank you so much, August. I really appreciate your super chat. August has put in a 1999 super chat and said, "You are the only person on YouTube having interesting and engaging conversations in the gaming space. Keep up the good work." Thank you so much, August. Thank you, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for that commentary. That's one of the reasons why I basically started this, is because I think that I've watched a lot of YouTube and a lot of things that different people are saying, but I think that there is a gap for some conversation. It's like we don't do, and we'll talk about this probably on this YouTube channel, on this YouTube video right here, this YouTube live stream. I don't typically do things like review of the trailer of the week or something like that, or some kind of releases that's gone out. I mean, we might from time to time, but I mean, typically that's not the kind of thing that I'm trying to do. I think there is an opportunity to actually have serious conversations on a bunch of different subjects that are not being had on YouTube. And I actually posted a YouTube video, a YouTube short. I was experimenting with YouTube shorts. I posted a short on this channel about maybe, 3 hours ago or something like that. That was about like, oh my God, I am so tired of listening to people talk about on YouTube, hey, if I don't like, for instance, Star Wars, hey, I don't like Star Wars, so let me talk about how much I don't like Star Wars for the next 100 hours. To me, it's pretty legitimate to do a review and say, oh my God, some kind of movie or TV show or something came out and I actually don't like it. Okay, say that once or twice. No problem. Say that. But then, oh my God, I can't spend 100 hours on it. We got to go on. Tomocrat says this, I'm getting lots of new ideas and points of view. Tolkien Orcs. Yes, thank you. And there's no desync. I think I fixed that problem. I did get pulled in with The Legend of Zelda, but the topics are interesting. Interesting. Well, we're going to get back to some more. Eventually, we'll get back to some more doing some video games, but I got to get these things painted so we can start doing some shows. So anyway, thank you very much, August. I really appreciate it. I very much appreciate it. All right, let's get back to our video. That publication regarding the significance of the development of Orcs and Orcishness through time. So let's jump in and take a look at a timeline of Orcish development. So, a brief timeline of Orcish development. 1937, the publication of The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. 1954, The Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers are published. 1955, The Return of the King is published. 1977, the Monster Manual for the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons is published. It contains separate entries for goblins, orcs, hobgoblins, and ogres. 1977, the Rankin Bass The Hobbit animated movie is released. 1978, Ralph Bakshi's animated The Lord of the Rings movie is released. 1979, the 4th edition of the Monster Manual for the 1st edition of Dungeons & Dragons is published. It's rather light on any kind of characterization of orcs beyond providing gaming statistics for tabletop role-playing games. Considerable space is dedicated to the composition of orc war parties and what kinds of weapons they carry. It notes that orcs dwell in places where sunlight is dim or non-existent, for they hate the light. Also, orcs are cruel and hate living things in general, but they particularly hate elves and will always attack them in preference for other creatures. They take slaves for work, food, and entertainment, torture, etc., but not elves, who they kill immediately. 1980, the Rankin Bass animated The Return of the King is released. 1983, Games Workshop publishes the 1st edition of the tabletop war game Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Orcs, of course, have long been a staple foe within the tabletop gaming community. As such, they were also an iconic evil army within Warhammer Fantasy Battle game. This 1st edition of the game scarcely contained any world building at all. It was a rule set for playing fantasy battle games. It included statistics for orcs and how to play them, but no other world building or history of the orcs were present in the book. Their characteristics beyond their tabletop representation were left to the mind of the players. 1987. Games Workshop publishes the 1st edition of Warhammer 40k, called Warhammer 4000 Rogue Trader. This brings orcs into GW's grim and dark. Let's see. Jason says he did a Zelda playthrough the other day, which I totally enjoyed. I did totally enjoy that, taking the time out to beat the original Zelda game, because I never did that as a kid. I totally enjoyed that. Tomocrat says, Jason says Heath did a Zelda playthrough the other day. That was inspiration for some of my dungeon maps. Zero the Blade says, Orcs, who is, by the way, I should say, a channel member. I really appreciate all of the channel members here. I'm trying to do a members only stream soon, maybe Sunday. I didn't get to do it this week, but this week during the weekday, but maybe this weekend, because I have been invited to go on a boar hunt and I want to get my gear together. So I'm thinking maybe the channel members would get some private channel member videos on getting the gear together to go boar hunting. So I do really appreciate everyone who super chats and that also is a channel member, because it helps support everything that we are doing here. So thank you, Zero the Blade. Zero the Blade says Orcs does get a bad rep because of Tolkien. Orcs do get a bad rep because of Tolkien, but it shouldn't be the go-to standard. I do like the D&D spin about them being somewhat spiritual believers. Now, Nico, I believe these are Argentinian pesos, I believe. So thank you very much for the super chat, Nico. Nico, for 450, I believe, Argentinian peso, says, on Tolkien Orcs, remember that everything exists in a context. Orcs in D&D are not tied to Morgoth, so it's not the same thing. The key to understanding them is meaning. What do they mean in any particular story? James Bacon says this is a fantastic timeline, and this is available also as an independent video here on YouTube. That's if you just look for a timeline of Orcishness, you will find this as well. So yeah, I think that orcs can mean different things, and I think that we need to evaluate what they mean in the context of any particular story that we have. That we don't often. I think we get screwed up when we start to cross the streams, but understanding what orcs mean in a particular story, I think, is very important. Though I think D&D, Tomocrat says, I think D&D used Tolkien orcs as a base. Soulbody has got a bad rap, Zero the Blade. Otherwise, we have no way to relate to evil. Without them, no one would know what evil is, how it is, or what it feels. Jappard says morality is the kind of the intersection between the subjective and the objective. Jason says, when I play an orc, PC or NPC, I play them like Klingons from Star Trek, The Next Generation. Honor above all, quick to fight, take no prisoners in war. James Bacon says, according to Tolkien, orcs are potentially redeemable. They are twisted elves, but elves are made of starlight, which Iluvatar deemed as good, along with the different firmament in Middle-earth. And Tolkien changed what he thought about orcs throughout his life. So there's what Tolkien said about orcs at a particular time, but then he did change up some things. Nico says, if you take the orcs away, you have to add some other demon-like character. James, which, in Dungeons and Dragons, we were talking about the Book of Vile Darkness. Okay, so maybe if you said, all right, you know what, orcs aren't evil anymore. They could be just people. At least in that context, we still had demons. We did have the 9 hells and the princes of the 9 hells and so forth. James says, but Tolkien is a famous waffler, so who knows about that? And, I don't know if I would characterize it exactly that way. But he certainly wrestled with orcs and their meaning throughout the work. Jason Carson, boar hunt, nice. Bonus points if you're using boar spears. I want to. I had friends years ago who wanted to go boar hunting with spears, and we never got to do that. So the first time I go out, I will probably use a rifle, because one of the things that I do want to do is I want to actually kill a boar. It doesn't have to be a boar. It could be another animal, but I think that I've got a friend who goes boar, or an acquaintance who said he would take me hunting. He hunts boars, and I want to, one of the things I want to do is not only go boar hunting with spears, but I do want to take out some animal with my rifle, which is sitting right over here. I want to use my rifle to take out an animal, clean it, and then process it for consumption and eat it. So I want to make sure that my rifle kills that particular animal. Now later, so for my first time out, I'm planning on using a rifle. But then as I go second, third times, I want to make sure that I am armored and equipped to actually go boar hunting with spears and take out the boar with a spear. So rifle probably first time out, but yeah, I do really want to go boar hunting with spears. Tomocrat says, orcs and goblins are my go-to big bad guys. Nico says, they are changeable when they can be corrupted. I think I missed the thread on that. James says, the orcs and Tolkien are, this kind of stuff generates such a fantastic conversation. Orcs and Tolkien represent A, illustrate the evil and irredeemability of Morgoth, and B, to provide the conflict across the second and third ages. Orc Quest played them kind of like you imagine Klingons. They serve their god as a badass. Warcraft started that, and orcs are shamanistic, brutal. We're going to talk about Warcraft when we get to this in the timeline here. I may not be able to go through everybody's comment this morning. Okay, let me just keep going. Oh, see, Orcus, right, exactly. I'm about to talk about that. Orcus is the origin of orc, and Orcus was a word for demon, exactly. All right, I'm going to keep painting here, and I'm going to continue for a little bit here. Science fiction fantasy world. Though the book, much like the original Warhammer Battle book, is highly focused on game rules. 1998. The Orcs of Thar is published, being an expansion to Dungeons & Dragons. It allows the players to create orcish characters, though elements of it are also somewhat comedic in nature, such as the spellings on the orcish character sheet and a manual of good conduct for orcish warriors that presents a comedic interpretation of orc soldiers as Roman-like legionnaires. 1991. Games Workshop publishes the book Warhammer Armies. It includes an army list for orcs, but army lists and statistics were the focus of the book, not history, lore, and world building. Most of the pages devoted to orcs and goblins are about the game statistics for playing them on the tabletop. Only 2 perfunctory paragraphs describe what goblins and orcs are. 1993. Games Workshop publishes the second edition of Warhammer 40k. Also 1993. The second edition of Middle-earth role-playing by Iron Crown Enterprises, an adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's work to the role-playing genre, states regarding orcs that, although they are not inherently evil, they are culturally and mentally predisposed toward darkness. It also writes, orcs worship darkness and power. Most revere Sauron as a god, respecting his ability to induce utter terror. Darkness, being capitalized in the original text, strongly associates these orcs with the demonic. 1993, The Complete Book of Humanoids is released for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. This book is dedicated to making monstrous humanoid races playable in the game. This includes goblins and orcs. Because this book was specifically written to allow people, the players, to play monstrous humanoids, it's particularly relevant to see how the book handles the subject of evil. First, it states that orcs tend to be lawful evil, half-orcs tend to be true neutral, but very notably, PC orcs and half-orcs may be of any alignment. The text of the book also emphasizes that an orc's life of war and battle may not be all that different from the life of other kinds of adventurers, and some orcs, especially orc women, can turn to the life of an adventurer and become important allies to more classic demi-human adventurers. According to the entry on orcs, orcs look like primitive humans with gray-green skin and coarse hair. They stoop slightly, have low jutting foreheads, snouts, canine-like teeth, and short pointed ears. It also reports that orcs are aggressive humanoids that live in tribal societies. They band together to hunt and raid, believing that to survive they must extend their territory. This need to expand puts them in a constant state of war with humans, elves, dwarves, goblins, and even other orc tribes. Also, the orc mentality views aggression as the natural order. They believe that other races are inferior to them and bully weaker creatures. Finally, it states, a few orcs even attempt to reject their evil natures and try to become honorable warriors. 1994. The original Warcraft game, Orcs and Humans, is released. It seems the release of this game was the first major milestone in the introduction of the idea of orcs as people into the public consciousness. This is my earliest recollection of the phenomenon, and it seems to square with the recollection of others I've contacted after a general inquiry on this topic. In this cursory... Let me go over here to the chat. Lots of stuff going on. K-Cons, yes, everybody is very chatty tonight. This is a popular topic that we've got here. Nico says, James Bacon, evil in Lord of the Rings is based on Catholic theology. Evil is just the lack of good. I believe this is stated explicitly, if not implicit, in the text. No, James says, according to Tolkien the Silmarillion, evil does not exist inherently, but is the corruption of something once good. But it absolutely exists. Joseph Carter says, primitive humans is a red flag for a lot of people right there. Hey, Robert. Hey, we're having a great conversation here. Good to see you, Robert. Nico is talking about why the orcs are constantly at the risk of civil war, as far as I know. So evil can only live as a parasite on the good. And when that good goes away, they die. Nico says, I'd like to know your thoughts on Morgoth and Sauron then. They did not fade to evil. They had to be forcibly destroyed, and even then can always reform. Tomocrat says, I see both of all your viewpoints, and I wonder if evil is also a concept of misdirection to lead people down a dark path. But see, okay, so we're having this really great conversation on the nature of evil here, but where is a fantastic place to have that? I think a fantastic place to have this conversation about evil is in the context of fantasy stories and fantasy role-playing games. I mean, so if you remove evil from fantasy role-playing games, are you removing some type of dialogue that we should be having in society, right? Because in any particular fantasy world, I don't have any problem with, okay, this is evil, this is not evil, or there exists evil, or there doesn't exist evil, or something like that. But the thing that I was interested in from this perspective was, what is that saying about our perception of evil as a culture? I am hungry. You know, I was cooking a steak earlier, and my pan caught fire, and I had to handle that earlier. Might go looking for something to eat here in just a moment. But here we go. Literature review. I wasn't able to conclusively document the phenomenon earlier than this. The Warcraft game manual included history and lore, not only for the human forces of Azeroth, but for the Orc Horde as well. It included an in-universe document, The Destiny of the Orcish Hordes, the history and legends concerning the invasion and domination of the human lands, scribed by Garona of the Shadow Council. Garona is presented as both of orc and human lineage, which is what allows her to write a more elegant history of the Orcish Horde than pure-blooded orcs have been able to do in the past. Garona presents the orcs as having a warlike and brutal society of their own, and not as a demonic race of creatures under the control of some greater devil-like Dark Lord. The textual information is evocative, but not lengthy, being that it was part of a computer game manual, but from that simple exposition, the world-building of Warcraft would spring. 1995. The updated and revised Monstrous Manual for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons is published. Although it allocates more space to each monster entry than previous monster manuals, most of the entry on orcs is devoted to how many of them the players are likely to encounter and their arms and armor outfitting options. Orcs are portrayed as aggressive and constantly at war, and depicted as ugly, far uglier than the more cartoonish depictions of orcs present in Warhammer and Warcraft. The book notes that orcs believe other species are inferior to them, and that bullying and slavery is part of the natural order. Interestingly, it notes that orcs have a reputation for cruelty that is deserved, but humans are just as capable of evil as orcs. It also notes that orcish religion is extremely hateful toward other species and urges violence and warfare. Regarding half-orcs, the book notes half-orcs tend to favor the orcish strain heavily, and as such are basically orcs, although 10% of these offspring can pass as ugly humans. This becomes a significant point to be revised, as half-orcs are later introduced as a player character race in later editions of Dungeons & Dragons. 1996, Warcraft 2: Tides of Darkness is released. This computer game was not only hugely successful and influential in the fantasy community, but it further developed orcs as people. It kept gamers interested in playing orcs and being one of their orcish commanders. 1996, Games Workshop publishes the Orcs and Goblins Army book for the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. This book stands as an interesting kind of halfway point in the evolution of orcs. In addition to all the game statistics for the army units, the book also includes several pages of history and lore relating to the orcs and goblins, though it does not develop their culture much further than that of a love of war. It presents them as ferocious, warlike, and frequently waging great bloody and destructive wars, but other than the following reference that states, "To the east of the World's Edge Mountains, over Mad Dog Path and Death Pass, is the Dark Land, a region of desolation, inhabited by all kinds of evil creatures, including chaos dwarves, orcs, goblins, and especially black orcs." The reference to the Dark Land seems to recall Mordor, Sauron's evil land in Middle-earth, but there is no devil-like Dark Lord, and the orcs are not elsewhere associated with great evil or demonic forces. Instead, the orcs are presented as fighting under chieftains of their own, called big bosses or war bosses, recalling how Shagrat and Gorbag referred to their higher-ups, for their own destructive purposes. 1998, Games Workshop publishes the 3rd edition of Warhammer 40k. 1999, Games Workshop publishes Codex Orcs. It goes into much more detail regarding orcs in the Warhammer 40k universe. Specifically, it develops the orc-fungus relationship. It explains that orcs are green-skinned and that this is a side effect of their genetic blend with fungi and photosynthetic organisms, making orcs something like complex lichens. The Codex explains that orcs lack a central nervous system, which allows them to feel much less pain and discomfort than humans. Their spores allow them to reproduce. Lots of stuff going on in the comments here. Joseph Carter, who is also a channel member. Thank you so much for being a channel member, Joseph. Really appreciate the channel members. Joseph Carter says, at the risk of another incendiary comment, there are some who don't want to allow people to have a dialogue for whatever reason. I'll stop short of ascribing a motivation to someone else. Robert says, yes, clearly stated good and evil could be essential to conflict in the fantasy world. D&D throws a twist into this with the neutrality, but also law and chaos, creating much more nuance and shades of gray, which we talked a lot about when we were talking about the Book of Vile Darkness. Robert says, opening up more complex set of morality and politics. Joseph says, I like the cartoony portrayal of orcs in Warhammer and Warhammer Quest, my favorite orc figures. Warcraft 2, Jason says, was my first game I played in the WoW franchise. Lots of love again for the Games Workshop Orcs. James says, I love the Games Workshop Orcs. Probably my favorite of every orky flavor. K-Con says, orcs in recent years have gone from ugly to handsome in a rough and barbaric way. Tomocrat says, I always think back to Star Trek TOS, the original series, using other aliens as a mirror for human nature. Nico, thank you again for the super chat. Thank you very much for the 450. I believe that's the Argentinian pesos super chat. Thank you so much. Heath, Nico says, Heath, on your question of removing evil, if you remove evil from myth, then people lose their ability to know evil, relate to it, understand it, feel it. Ask them what evil is. They won't know.
If you remove evil from myth, then people lose their ability to know evil, relate to it. I think I agree with this. Because even as, like I say, I'm not a particularly religious person now. I came out of different religious traditions. I'm not religious now. But yet, even if I don't think that there is something, there's actually a demon in real life, like I don't believe in angels or demons in real life today, I don't want to remove that from mythology for maybe the kind of reason that you're talking about here, Nico. Because actually, there still have been a couple of times, I can think of 2 times in life, when I was dealing with something and I was like, oh my God, that's evil. And so I just left. Like, I'm not doing that. And, you know, you probably tell, I talk about, you know, I'm doing stories about heaven and hell and going insane with evil aliens. And we've talked about Lovecraftian stuff. And I've been filming in my backyard people who are doing Lovecraftian branding ceremonies for Cthulhu and stuff like that. So I'm very comfortable with engaging with a bunch of that material. But I still personally do have an understanding of when, okay, now wait a minute. Now here's a line where I actually think I'm dealing with something that is evil and I don't want to do that. And so I just stop. Oh, Jappards is concurring, Nico. The Hero Quest orc is not necessarily evil. He's just not he's not necessarily mean. He's probably just not too bright. What he definitely isn't, though, is human. Well, that's something else, too. So JDM, we're talking about terminology here. What is everyone's thoughts on the sameness or difference of orcs and goblins? Yeah, Tolkien tends to use orcs and goblins somewhat interchangeably as far as their terms, like different people who call that. But although in traditional fantasy, when I'm dealing with something, I typically use orcs and goblins in different terms. I did do a deep dive on orcs. Yeah, the fungus stuff here. And the fungus I thought was really interesting because it was a way to have orcs be something that you can kill, but it just to basically sidestep that nature of evil. Nico says, Heath, I'm no RPG expert, but isn't this trend for playing orcs related to the rise in grimdark fantasy and anti-heroes and novels? I'm not sure, but I think it does have something to do with games, whether that is role-playing games or war games, that as people wanted to play more orcs, then what needed to happen was that orcs needed to become less demonic. Because people, maybe you'd be less comfortable with playing something demonic. I'm going to have to skip down through the comments a bit. Okay. Let's keep going. Produce asexually, which explains the lack of orc females. This reproductive process basically involves the dispersion of spores from a decomposing orc corpse, meaning that killing an orc may literally create more orcs, which also explains why orcs are so difficult to eradicate and how they are able to infiltrate and build up large populations virtually anywhere. The only known solution to this problem is to incinerate the entire area to destroy all orc spores. 2000. The Player's Handbook for the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons is published. Significantly, half-orcs now appear as a player character race. This predates the release of the World of Warcraft game, but follows Warcraft 2 Tides of Darkness by several years. Perhaps the authors of the 3rd edition PHB felt the influence of Warcraft when they included half-orcs, but regardless, their inclusion allowed orcs to experience orcishness within Dungeons & Dragons as they had been doing through Warcraft. It's interesting that the half-orcs of 3rd edition seem to recall Garona of both orc and human lineage, who had laid the foundation for orc as person within the fictional Warcraft universe. Regarding half-orcs, the book states, in the wild frontiers, tribes of human and orc barbarians live in uneasy balance, fighting in times of war and trading in times of peace. Half-orcs who are born on the frontier may live with either human or orc parents, but they are nevertheless exposed to both cultures. Some, for whatever reason, leave their homeland and travel to civilized lands, bringing with them the tenacity, courage, and combat prowess that they have developed in the wild. Also significant in this edition of D&D is the description of half-orcs that states, half-orcs inherit a tendency toward chaos from their orc parents, but like their human parents, they favor good and evil in equal proportions. Half-orcs raised among orcs and willing to live out their lives with them are usually the evil ones. Being a half-orc granted one a +2 to strength, but did impose 2 negative ability modifiers, -2 to intelligence and -2 to charisma, as their orcish lineage makes them dull and crude. Hi everyone, I'm Heath, and in this video we're going to be doing part 2 of our series.
So that is part 2. Yeah, explosive chat, yes.
Nico says, I do believe in demons. The demon of anger, the demon of hate, the demon of envy, of greed. They are always beside you, pushing. As the influence of Morgoth as minions. That's the idea. JDN GDM says, I think it also has a connection to identity politics. I'm in my mid-30s and run D&D at my university for a lot of teenagers, early 20s. The idea of orc racism has come up a lot at the tables. I believe I can totally believe that. I didn't realize the Orcs as fungus was that late. According to what I was able to find. Yes, okay, so I did screw up, and I think I'm about to correct that in this next video. So half-orcs were a choice in the first edition AD&D. They were a choice, and then half-orcs left D&D, and then they came back in 3rd edition. So they were present. They didn't just appear in 3rd edition for the first time. You're right, and I think I'm about to correct that in this next part of the video I'm going to be talking about right here. Heath, did Heath include the half-orcs in 1st edition? No, I'm about to correct that mistake. Scott Graham. Hello, Scott. I even apply moral ambiguity to devils and demons. They are also the same type of beings as gods, angels, spirits. Devil, demon is a matter of allegiance. Oh, yes. Please do hit the thumbs up. So, yes, thank you. Also, push the thumbs up if you're enjoying these conversations and show Heath the love he deserves. Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate that. And also, yes, those. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me of that. And, you know, I should also say, if you are here and you're not part of the Ravenkeep Discord server, let me put the Discord server link in here. Thank you so much for reminding me, Mike. Will be part of the Discord server. I just put that link in the chat. I would love to have you. So yeah, you're right. It was removed from 2nd edition because my first experience with Dungeons and Dragons was 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and it did not have half-orcs as a player character option. But then it was returned. It was returned in 3rd edition. That's absolutely true. Oh, Jason says, I've never seen orcs as demons, just another race in D&D. Depends on, when you come into all of this, I suppose. All right, let's keep going then. Of a timeline of orcishness where we're looking at the development of orcs through the decades. And in this video, we're going to be starting in 2001, and we're going to be talking a lot about the influence of film on our perceptions of orcishness, starting with Peter Jackson's adaptation of The Lord of the Rings for the big screen. But first, I've got something that I need to add to the first video on the timeline, because as was pointed out in the comments, I did miss something that's rather important, and that is the 1st edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which does allow half-orc characters. And so thank you very much to the people in the comments who pointed that out, because once that was mentioned in the comments, I went, oh yeah, I do remember that for a 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, it was very much about the reintroduction of the half-orc as a player race, and not the introduction of the half-orc for the first time, because the half-orc was in the 1st edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in that player's handbook, but it was not in the 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons handbook as a player's race. And it was that 2nd edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that I was most familiar with. So I did accidentally overlook the 1st edition player's handbook. So I brought that up right here. So this is a 1978 publication. So we need to go back and drop this into 1978. This is the 1st edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons player's handbook, which says half-orcs. Orcs are fecund and create many crossbreeds, most of the offspring of such being typically Orcish. However, some 1/10 of Orc-human mongrels are sufficiently non-Orcish to pass for human. Complete details of Orcs and crossbreeds will be found under the heading Orc in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual, which we did look at. As it is assumed that player characters which are of half-orc race are within the superior 10%, they have certain advantages. A half-orc character can become a cleric, maximum of 4th level, a fighter, maximum of 10th level, a thief, maximum of 8th level, or an assassin. It is also possible for a half-orc character to operate in 2 classes at the same time. Tells you more about being 2 classes with a half-orc, but also half-orc characters are able to speak in the common tongue of humanity, their alignment language, and Orcish as well. Those characters are able to learn a maximum of 2 additional languages. They have infravision, and then also half-orc characters have bonuses of +1 to both their strength and constitution scores initially rolled, but they must subtract a charisma penalty of -2. Okay, so that is how half-orcs appeared in the PHB of the first edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Then it was removed for second edition, and then it was something that came back for the third edition handbook. All right, so there we are. Now let's continue our timeline starting in 2001. 2001, Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring movie is released. This movie sets the tone for the portrayal of orcs as a demonic force that will continue through this movie trilogy. The orcs are first shown in the prologue as an evil demon-like force, the last alliance of men and elves battle in Mordor at Mount Doom, complete with the association of Hellfire in a previous scene with the forging of the One Ring in the Cracks of Doom. The movie also features the demon-like orcs of Isengard in the service of the wizard Saruman. They are portrayed in direct opposition to nature, which is positively portrayed by ripping down trees. They are further associated with hell-like imagery with the fires of the foundries beneath Isengard. Saruman also creates the Uruk-hai, ugly and evil orcs that emerge from slimy sacs in the earth. Being that hell is traditionally under the earth, the emergence of the Uruk-hai super orcs from the earth further associates them with the demonic. The Fellowship comes face to face with the orcs in Moria, which are depicted as demonic in nature with drum beats and animalistic screeches. These orcs are also depicted as having established a cult to worship the Balrog who lives deep within Moria. The orcish armor and costume have been made to reflect their interpretations of the form of the Balrog. Gandalf refers to the Balrog, who they worship, directly as a demon of the ancient world, and as the Flame of Udun. The Tolkien Gateway notes that Udun is the depth, and a concept usually associated with hell. Udun was the Sindarian word for Ut-Umno, Morgoth's stronghold before the First Age, hell. Morgoth, of course, is the wayward Ainur who filled the role of the devil within Tolkien's legendarium. The goblins of Moria are lesser demons in the service of this greater evil. When also associated with the imagery of Moria being a terrifying underground place lit with red light, especially at the bridge of Khazad-dûm, the association of the orcs of Moria with the demonic is very thorough. When Saruman's Uruk-hai catch up to the Fellowship at Amon Hen, the demons are no longer confined to the deep and the dark, but they're able to come into the light and pursue the heroes during the day. Its symbology is that of the demonic forces now on the move, aggressively encroaching on what was once safe. They are no longer just content to capture or kill heroes who venture into their realms, but are actively attacking and pushing their boundaries. 2002, Peter Jackson's The Two Towers movie is released. This movie abbreviates the Uruk-hai chapter with Merry and Pippin captured, but continues the demonic imagery of the orcs, with the orcs... Let's see, lots of stuff going on in the comments. K-Con says, ugh, racial level limitations was an absolute bane of early D&D, and it never worked. That was still present in second edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons when I was playing, that some races could only go to certain levels in certain classes. Fecund, yes. We learn all kinds of, especially on this channel, we do frequently have to look up new words and expand our vocabulary. Fecund, I love that we learned more words through gaming. Joseph says, and I'll say further, it ends the discussion in both directions. If you call me a racist like that for breaking some rule you decided, if it sounds like this has happened, and it has, I'm done with you. Robert says, second E was sanitized, removed half-orcs, demons, devils, and I bet some other stuff after the Satanic Panic. Wizards brought them back to show they were hip. Hey. You know, but when I was playing it, I didn't really perceive that. When I was playing second edition, I didn't really perceive that it had been sanitized. I think that I was vaguely aware that some things had been renamed, like demons or devils, whichever one it was, to something like Beatazu, but I wasn't really aware of that. JDN, we're about to talk about this, says, what do you think about orcs having set ability scores modifiers for PCs and or the removal of all ability score modifiers from races in 1D&D? Yeah, that seems to be a big thing, right? That's no longer something that's particularly politically correct, right? To have something that would be a racial ability modifier that might apply that something that has to do with a race as defined in fantasy, which is very different from race as we describe it, like in the modern world. But race is described as a fantasy, which is more like species. Maybe not exactly species, but more like species. That, oh, you can't have something that is some kind of racial modifier, especially if it's a racial negative about something about your biological race. Yeah, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. Let's see. Wait, there's a discussion about free will going on. Maybe we'll talk more about free will. I'm going to skip that right now. I like discussions of free will because I think it relates to the angels and the jinn. Sometimes Cameron and I have talked about angels and the jinn free will. So, but yeah, only a little silly. If there's a deep metaphysical question, if evil comes from free will, then is free will evil? Oh, whoa. What a question. I think the free will conversation, yeah, is a little bit besides what I'm talking about right here with evil, but it's certainly tied to it because as I've talked about, and I think has come up in this when we're talking about the nature of Satan and what caused the fall of Satan. I was specifically talking to different preachers and priests of different religious traditions about how that relates to the fall of Satan. All right, let's keep going then. At the hell like Barad-dûr and Isengard. Most significantly, the movie features the Battle of Helm's Deep, in which the Uruk-hai of Isengard assault the men of Rohan. Here again, the imagery of the battle is dark and stormy, with the Uruk-hai issuing bestial growls and roars. 2003, Peter Jackson's The Return of the King movie is released. This movie features an abbreviated conversation between Shagrat and Gorbag, and one that alters the role of the two orcs. The movie includes the dramatic storming of Minas Tirith by the orcs in which Hel comes to Gondor. In it, Grond, the great battering ram the orcs have brought to destroy the gates of Minas Tirith, is flaming as it penetrates the gate, Hel's breaching of the White City. The movie ends with the Battle of the Black Gate and represents the final triumph over Orcishness after the One Ring is destroyed, with the collapse of the Tower of Barad-dûr and the opening of the ground into which much of the orc army falls. 2004. The massively multiplayer online role-playing game World of Warcraft is released. Its success led to the release of many expansions. In it, players could assume the role of an orc of the Horde, and those who did were presented with a cultural richness equivalent to the people of Azeroth. By this time, and in this context, the idea of the conflict between humans and orcs was no longer the conflict between humanity and a demonic force, but between two peoples, where people is not defined by Homo sapien DNA, but by cultural characteristics, social development, and perhaps, most importantly, common morality. In this line of fantasy development, orcs had shed their connection with the demonic and had begun to stand on their own. 2011, Skyrim is released. In it, orcs are also depicted as people, and in many ways just people, who do not appear to have a connection with the demonic. My familiarity with Skyrim is very limited, however. Others will have more information. 2012, Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey movie is released. 2013, Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug movie is released. 2014, Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, The Battle of Five Armies movie is released. By the time of the Hobbit films, the depiction of the orc had undergone a shift since the Lord of the Rings movie. While still influenced by the orc as demon conceptualization, there does appear to be a drift toward orcs as people. At times, their representation is something that would, perhaps, not even be out of place within the universe of the World of Warcraft. In contrast with the dark and dire depiction of the goblins of the Misty Mountains in the book The Hobbit, the movie takes a much more comical approach to them, including, most especially, the representation of the Great Goblin. The orcs, led by Bolg, who pursue the dwarves across Middle-earth, are larger and more hulkingly muscular in nature than even how the Uruk-hai were depicted in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. 2014. The 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons is released. Not only do half-orcs remain a player race, but it goes so far as to state that half-orcs are created from marriage unions. Whether united under the leadership of a mighty warlock or having fought to a standstill after years of conflict, orc and human tribes sometimes form alliances, joining forces into a large horde to the terror of civilized lands nearby. When these alliances are sealed by marriages, half-orcs are born. The introduction of marriage into orcish society seems to be a deliberate inversion of orcs as demons, because the religious connotations of marriage, which often rises to the level of a sacrament in Christian faith, would be something that one would expect the demonic to abhor. The 5th edition also removes the attribute penalties for being a half-orc. They retain the +2 strength modifier, but rather than suffering penalties to intelligence and charisma, half-orcs gain 1 point of constitution. Also in 2014, George R.R. Martin weighed in on the subject of orcishness in his interview with Rolling Stone, asking, Tolkien can say that Aragorn...
Scott Graham says, I remember it bothering me in the 70s, at age 12, reading The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, that orcs are somehow inherently evil with apparently no choice or chance at redemption. I think this kind of thing does speak a lot to our own personal perception of evil. Let's see. Oh, James says, man, Heath, you really hit a home run with this research. Well, thank you. I felt like we needed this timeline.
Became king and reigned for 100 years, and he was wise and good. But Tolkien doesn't ask the question, what was Aragorn's tax policy? Did he maintain a standing army? What did he do in times of flood and famine? And what about all the orcs? By the end of the war, Sauron is gone, but all the orcs aren't gone. They're in the mountains. Did Aragorn pursue a policy of systematic genocide and kill them? Even the little baby orcs in their little orc cradles? 2015. Perhaps the idea of orc as person is taken to its furthest extent yet by the fantasy author Lou Anders in the second book of his Thrones and Bones trilogy, Nightborn, published in 2015.
See, I think it does too. That would be... I think that did miss the point of having some type of fantasy mythological manifestation of evil in your world to all of a sudden be talking about, no, wait a minute, what's happening to the baby orc in his crib? I agree with you, James. I think that quote missed the point. Yeah, okay, so Joseph also agrees with that. Martin misses the point. I think he did. I agree with that. God, Cool Name RPG just to hit 30K. Hold on, I had that up. Oh my God. Oh, I meant to bring that up and I forgot. So the Cool Name RPG just funded. I meant to post that. So it just concluded and hit $30,524. Thank you, everyone who's joined that. I backed it. I've been enjoying that. So we will continue to look at the Cool Name RPG. So congratulations to Mark. That's fantastic. Congratulations. I'm really looking forward to see what's coming. But yes, I agree. I think that quote was I think what Martin was talking about there missed the point. I completely agree with that. That's, to me, that's crossing the streams. What I call that, crossing the streams, like when you're talking about dealing with something like mythological evil. That's something very different from dealing with, all kinds of things that are shades of gray. So, yeah, I agree with you. In it, he introduces the Uskiri, the orc equivalent species in his world. They are a deliberate inversion of the idea of orc as a demonic savage. Instead, Anders makes them the most cultured of all the different species in the world. The Uskiri are empire builders of high culture with great trading networks.
Their conquests are undertaken to bring the benefits of their high culture to the rest of the world. Rather than being crude and reveling in ugliness, the Uskeri enjoy art and music and are capable of building beautiful things, including buildings. Anders writes that the Uskeri Empire is now one of the largest and most sophisticated empires on the continent. In addition to being great warriors, the Uskeri are advanced in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, floral arrangements, and dance. Anders explained the genesis of the idea of the Uskeri to me in personal correspondence, saying, "For years I've been disturbed by the wholesale slaughter of orcs in The Lord of the Rings and the idea that any race was irredeemably and unilaterally evil. So way before I ever thought to write a fantasy novel, I determined that if I ever did, my orcs wouldn't be a bestial, ignorant, savage race, but the most sophisticated people on the planet. When I wrote Nightborn, I remembered this and created the Uskeri, who are a massive empire. They're still aggressive and expansionist, but they're coming to conquer you not to wipe you out and sacrifice you to a dark god. No, they're going to conquer you for your own good, and after they've conquered you, they'll build schools and libraries and lift you up to their level, whether you want to be or not." 2016.
Nico says this quote, continuing on the George R. R. Martin area, says this quote goes to show that Martin doesn't understand the Tolkienian fantasy. He just made a sci-fi dressed as fantasy clothes. Ask yourself, did you write a dragon or a flying lizard that breathes fire? See, if you're trying to deal with, it's not illegitimate to deal with, okay, if you've got this particular race, what are you going to do when you're going to take them all out, and what are you going to do? You're going to kill their children in their cribs. But if I were going to be writing that, I would make everybody human. Because then all of a sudden, dealing with that is something else. Like, okay, now we've got this particular tribe of people or something, and they're defeated. And what do we do with them? Do we kill all of their children in their crib? That's very different than asking, what do you do with orcs, in my opinion. And it's not an illegitimate question to ask, but I would do that with people and not with orcs. Robert says, it's a good discussion. The possibility of no redemption is as troubling one if you get the same dilemma with zombies and demons. I address this in Children's the Grave. People choose to become them, to avoid the afterlife, which is known to be nothing but hell, no paradise. What if there is no heaven but only hell? Oh my God. Yes. Congratulations to Cool Name. We'll have Mark back on. We'll talk about this. The orc itself as a playable race is introduced into 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons in Volo's Guide to Monsters, published in 2016. Its ability score adjustments included a strength score increase of 2, constitution increase of 1, and an intelligence score reduction of 2. 2020. In its article Diversity and Dungeons & Dragons, published on its website 17 June 2020, Wizards of the Coast, the publishing company of D&D, directly addresses its philosophy on the personhood of orcs. They write, throughout the 50-year history of D&D, some of the peoples in the game, orcs and drow being two of the prime examples, have been characterized as monstrous and evil, using descriptions that are painfully reminiscent of how real-world ethnic groups have been and continue to be denigrated. Thus, in this article, Wizards of the Coast deliberately calls out orcs as being people. The article goes on to say, we present orcs and drow in a new light in our 2 most recent books, Eberron, Rising from the Last War, and Explorer's Guide to Wildemont. In those books, orcs and drow are just as morally and culturally complex as other peoples. We will continue that approach in future books, portraying all the peoples of D&D in relatable ways and making it clear that they are as free as humans to decide who they are and what they want to do. 2021. The reduction of orcish intelligence in 5e Dungeons & Dragons was removed in version 3 of the errata document for Volo's Guide to Monsters. This goes along with other changes like removing alignment from the racial template of both the half-orcs and tieflings, leaving such things out of the core rules to be addressed in other world-specific materials. Before concluding, it's interesting to note the usage of the word orc over time, at least according to Google's provided dictionary information on the word. The word orc begins to see a dramatic increase in usage around 1998, and its usage continues to climb through the time of the heightened popularity of fantasy with the release of the Lord of the Rings films and the World of Warcraft MMORPG.
Okay, so this concludes my brief timeline of the development of orcs from the demonic two persons through the citation of selected fantasy publication through the decades. Now, I still don't make any representation regarding the completeness of this history. There are still probably things that I was not familiar with and so left out. So if there is something else that needs to be considered, please let me know down in the comments, like people did with the first edition of the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons book. That was very important. Let me know if there are things that need to be added down in the comments, and we can continue to kind of expand this documentation for this discussion on orcish development. Now, I do have some thoughts on the orcs as demons versus orcs as people kind of dichotomy, and I want to analyze that more, but I'm still pulling together some of my thoughts on that. Probably I'll do another video on that in the future, but I have been discussing this subject of orcs and the representation of evil with different guests on the Table Talk show that I've been doing on Tuesday and Thursday nights with people who are in the fantasy and gaming communities. In some cases, I've clipped out the discussion, like with Lou Anders and Mark Tassin, and I put them in the playlist so you can kind of see how the discussion is developing. I do think that it's interesting how much of the development of orcs from demons to people have occurred because of and perhaps been driven by the fantasy gaming community. And it seems that as gamers have increasingly stepped into the role of orcs and orcish commanders, the trend has been to increasingly humanize them. This might be because of an aversion to having human players actually sit down and play a demonic force within the game. Okay, let's talk about another interesting subject
here. So next we're going to be going to the different discussions that I had with different people about orcs and orcishness. And I think it's important to have those discussions. Some of these you may have already seen, but important to have this discussion in the context of that particular timeline and our development of orcs. JDM says, I like the idea of those moral quandaries at the gaming table, and I agree that a human-only world might be the best way to handle that. Joseph Carter, who also channel member, there we go, specifically with Martin's quote, I know what Aragorn's tax policy is, and I know what he would do with the orcs, but I don't need to be told explicitly because I understand Tolkien's calendar. Oh, somebody tossed in $500 to the Cool Name RPG? That is awesome. James Bacon says, yes, exactly. Joseph Carter says, Aragorn lived as a poor man and understands their existence. That and his character nobility informs me what his tax policy would be. Oh, this is getting deep. Scott says, evil is a myth that was virtually never a racial trait. Even demons in Christian mythology are angels who made a choice. JDN says, I think Aragorn was very Christ-like in his place in the story. His mercy and restraint are illustrated, and I think he would have been they would have been merciful to the orcs. He is certainly more merciful to the humans who followed Sauron. And I'm not too harsh on Martin. He openly said Tolkien was a big influence, but he uses his own writer with his own stories. But he is his own writer with his own stories to tell. I'm a fan of both. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Tolkien. That's probably one of my primary influences. But likewise, later in life, I really liked George R. R. Martin. It would be better if he had actually finished his stories. But I do appreciate what Martin is doing. And I understand that he's trying to tell a different story and he has different questions to ask. And I think those are important questions, too, that he's addressing. And I think that they would have been more effective if he'd actually been able to finish his books. Scott says, on the other hand, humans have always demonized other tribes and nations. The Gauls and Huns were goblins and orcs from Roman point of view. The Romans were advanced evil orcs from the Huns and Gauls point of view. Tolkien also has the orcs kind of take themselves out often. And Aragorn knows that the orcs are leaderless. How they are created is irrelevant. They're here. Some of them will prey upon people in his kingdom. Some won't, especially if you give them an alternative. Exactly. JDM says, Lord of Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire are very different kinds of stories. For example, I didn't need to learn of Tolkien's considered sequel in which he did send people to help teach the orcs another way to live. Know that Aragorn would do that. Thank you very much for the super chat, Nico. Nico sent in another super chat saying that Tolkien wrote myth that deal with gods. Martin's drama deals with life
like humans. These are two very different things. I agree with that. Orcs, Aragorn, Gandalf are all more ideas made flesh than people. Yeah, I think I agree with that. And I enjoy both modes of storytelling. I very much enjoy Tolkien's storytelling, and I very much also enjoy George R. R. Martin's storytelling. Like I said, with the caveat that I wish he'd actually finished it, because I think that what the message that I think that he was trying to tell has gotten lost because the story, I completely understand, has gotten a bit rambling and also not been finished. So, that's an important critique. But I know people who don't like Tolkien at all, but who loved George R. R. Martin's stories. And likewise, people who don't really appreciate Martin, but they like George R. R. Martin, J.R.R. Tolkien. I appreciate both types of storytelling. But important to that is you have to recognize that they are different kinds of storytelling. And what they're trying to say is different. And it's not fair to judge one by the other's criteria, I don't think. All right, let's see what, let's go on to what Lou was saying about orcs and the way he was representing them. Because this is something that I've been writing on. And actually, I talk about Lou's take on this in one of the videos, but it's not done editing yet. They're taking me a long time to edit. My first video, I've got a series of 3 videos on orcs and the personhood of orcs and how they manifest in fantasy over the years. The first video is out. So the first video you can find on the channel. The second video is going to be a timeline. Second and third, I believe, are both timelines, but they're taking a long time to edit. And I talk about Lou's placement of that in here. But I think that his take on this is very interesting. So do you want to talk about your philosophy of orcs and how that has manifested in your worlds?
It's always bothered me since I was a kid that the orcs are just wiped out. They run into the forest and they don't come out, and there are no more orcs. And it was always bothered me that it was okay to commit genocide against them because they're just unilaterally bad. And I, years ago, before I even knew I was going to write a novel, I said, if I ever write a novel, my orcs are not going to be mindless, evil savages that you can just butcher indiscriminately. They're going to be the most sophisticated people on the planet. And I came back to that in my second novel, where they're not called orcs, they're called Oskiri, but they're gray-skinned, white-haired orcs. And the Oskiri, they are expansionistic empire. They do want to conquer, but they want to do so because they feel that they have a compulsion to elevate the rest of the world to their level. So they come in, conquer a place, kill the leaders, then they build libraries and schools, and everybody becomes part of the Oskirian empire. And I have a character named Dargan Urgal, who is an ambassador from the Oskiri Empire, who's traveling the world because he thinks all the barbarians are charming, but he wants to see them before they get inevitably absorbed into his own empire for the greater good. And I like that about them. So there's no savage brute orc. There's just a highly expansionistic, highly superior culture.
I think that the humanization of the orc has been something that has gone on over the decades.
It probably goes back to that original World of Warcraft game.
I think it does.
Yeah, where you can play as the human or you can play as the orc.
As far as I've been able to find, that was the first. And other people in the chat and who are watching, please let me know if you have another reference. But that's the earliest reference, the original Warcraft Orcs versus Human, that started to introduce this idea of kind of orc as a person in a broad sense. Maybe there's an earlier reference. I would love to find it. But whenever I ask, people also bring up that one.
Well, you've seen that cartoon where the people who worship the rabbit god and the people who worship the duck god, and they're trying to wipe each other out.
No, I haven't seen.
Oh, it's hysterical. It's just a bunch of knights on 2 hillsides, and they're both charging into the valley, and they're both like, we worship the one true rabbit god, but they worship the duck god. And it's a silhouette that looks like this. And so depending on how you do it.
So this is Scott Graham brings up today, Russians are orcs for the Ukrainians. And, I wanted to create some kind of video on this, but I never got to. I was collecting information, and I was collecting images about the perception of Russian soldiers as orcs, because I think that's a fantastically interesting thing. I was collecting images and memes that were
had been created and put on Reddit and elsewhere, and I think they're still sitting in a file on my computer someplace, but I never got to make that video. Maybe I will eventually, but I think that's an important extension of this conversation, that you've got memes that directly represent Russians as orcs. And if Russians are demonic and you're talking about the demonization or the dehumanization of the enemy, of the foe, you're talking about deliberately equating Russian soldiers to something that is demonic. I think it's a really interesting subject. And I think it's something that, like, if I were still in academia, in geopolitics, like the popular geopolitics kind of field, the referring to Russian soldiers as orcs is something that should definitely be talked about. I think that would be worthy of an article and worthy of research. JDN says, I think Martin has talked recently about how he's actively writing it. Well, maybe he has. And maybe, I mean, he may still get it out. I mean, I hope he does. I will read it when he eventually does. But so the Euskeri, I think it starts with a U, actually, are basically the Romans. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, I would still love to see Martin finish. I mean, I will read them if he finishes. What does Robert say? Robert Joseph says, I do not like Martin's stories because his world makes some awful things very casual, and they would be in his world and have been in ours. I do not like Martin's stories because his world makes some very awful things very casual, and they would be in his world and have been in ours. I just have a hard time reading that. But what about like Dark Sun? I mean, the Dark Sun campaign setting clearly does about the same things. Makes some very awful things in our world. It makes some very awful things very casual in his world. But I do hear you. I understand.
It's a duck or a rabbit, and that's what World of Warcraft was for me, the original one, because you play as the human, then you play as the orc, and the resource building is exactly the same, and so it's impossible to play both sides for any length of time without realizing that who's good and who's bad is a matter of where you're standing.
Does your
very subversive for an early video game?
And it has had a whole lot of impact. Because I think, and also as you have people who are playing orcs, they become less demonic. I think probably because game companies also, if you're going to be playing this, probably also, it's a cycle that, we should probably tone down the demonic aspect of this. Especially with the satanic panic and things like that, orcs can just be like people, right? How do you think that that your own views on the demonic or existence of evil influence that opinion that you had on orcs?
I don't know. I have not explored what the hells are in my world yet. There's a fascinating book called The Big Book of Hell, by the way. It came out a long time ago, 20, 25 years ago, which is an examination of all the different cultures of the world's views on afterlives that punish you. And I don't know what place it holds in, because in Norengard, there's no place of punishment. When you die, you either, if you're not selected for one of the warriors' halls, then you go to Neth's Cave, which is just kind of a place where everybody else goes. But it might be boring, but it's not a place of punishment. And the people who are evil linger on as Draugr, as the undead in their burrows. So the ones who are too consumed by anger or greed or lust or regret to properly die linger near the surface in their graves as undead. And so that is the hell. It's a hellish existence of being, of being unable to fully die, and having this undead existence. I feel like there's Star Trek, Star Wars, and Doctor Who. Star Trek, evil is a verb, not a noun. Evil is ignorance. It's a lack of understanding. It's failure to appreciate that we're all one, that everyone should, and that enlightened altruism is the better philosophy. And so the progress in Star Trek is for races like the Klingons, who are evil races to begin with, to become rehabilitated as they evolve and mature. And Doctor Who, evil is a real thing. It's the monster from outer space who's made a deal with the greedy corporate guy to sell out the Earth, and it's a noun. And in Star Wars, I don't. It's just a back and forth. It's continual. And I think I prefer the Star Trek perspective on evil.
Well, that's interesting. Because in this series on orcs that I'm working on, once I get past the timeline, I've been trying to come up with my own some kind of analysis and synthesis of it. And I think it does have to do with your take on it, with whether or not someone does believe in an objective evil or whether they don't.
Yeah.
And then and where our society is and how that changes, has changed orcishness to our society. Because, if assuming you do believe in a good and evil, like if you're good and evil, you wouldn't want to demonize the human. Things that are human should not be demonized because you're supposed to recognize their humanity. But then perhaps we should also recognize the reverse of that, which is, well, you don't want to humanize the demonic. If you believe in evil, you don't want to humanize it. That would also be something that was bad. If you believed in that as, a metaphysical thing. And I think there's something in there, but I'm still working on thinking all the way through that and what that is. Because actually, do you know that there are people who call the Russian soldiers in Ukraine orcs?
No, that's
there we go.
If you go to Reddit, because that is part of the thing. I was like, well, this is sort of my theme of demonizing the human, because I found some pictures of this from Reddit for people who have actually drawn the Russian soldiers as orcs, and then also it's not uncommon to just refer to Russian soldiers as killing orcs. And I think there's probably an academic article in it, if I were to go back to academic writing. So I think there's probably a lot more to the philosophy of orcishness that we should continue to talk about in society today. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and all of that jazz. It really helps.
Let's see. Nico says, the reason why Aragorn's tax policy is inappropriate is because Aragorn's not a person. He's the idea. By his actions, we connect with the essence of kinghood. Kinghood doesn't write policy. Oh, okay, so Joseph, you're also not into Dark Sun, so there we go. Oh, okay. We got information, or we've got commentary on Tolkien as allegory. Do I want to get into that right now? I think I'll not get into that right now. And what exactly that means, that you're not writing an allegory. I'm going to skip some of those comments. We'll come back to Tolkien as allegory at some other time. Anders Orc sounds like Chronotopia Orcs, an old tabletop board game. I'm not sure. I don't know about that. JDM says, yes, Heath, I've heard about that. I'm in grad school for European history, and so I'm fascinated and deeply saddened by the war. Robert says, I think evil can only be objective if it's, again, some sort of valid choice. There has to be some rational basis for that choice, no matter how misguided, because they are complex morally. Yeah, we talked about, let's see, the nature of evil and choice, I believe with Cameron. Cameron was talking about that. I forget that you can only be demonic if you don't have a choice. I forget which way we went on that. Can you be demonic if you have a choice or you don't have a choice? Maybe he was saying that you had to have a choice to be demonic. Or I was thinking that maybe things that were demonic could be created. Yeah, I think that's an important topic that is its own topic, James.
a lot. But also, please check out The Cultists, the web series on this channel about modern-day D&D playing Lovecraftian cultists who just want to worship Cthulhu in a world full of people who just don't understand. Season 1 is on the channel now. But also, please check out my YouTube channel. I have over 150 videos on tabletop games and the fantasy genre. If you've enjoyed this video, you might enjoy many of them as well. I look forward to seeing you for them and many more videos to come. Okay, well then let's go, while we're on this deeper subject, and let's talk about the nature of evil. I've been working on a series of videos, and I've been talking to other guests, all the guests that have come on the show so far, about the nature of evil, because I've done this video series on the nature of Orcishness and the nature of evil there. So I would be interested to know from, if you're talking about, from an Indian perspective, like its nature of evil, how that's represented in fantasy. How did you choose to represent that? Because I did notice as I was reading that first chapter and then also these other articles on the Radiant Citadel that there's this force that could be other things in all the different adventures. I don't have access to those, but this non. Yes, it's Solzhenitsyn. It's Solzhenitsyn. People corrected me on that later. It wasn't Martin. Martin said something about, I was getting my quotes confused. It's Solzhenitsyn who's talked about the line of evil going between all human hearts. It was something about, Martin said something else about like human heart in conflict with itself is something that's worth writing about or something like that. There was a similar quote that Martin said, but that quote was Solzhenitsyn, yes. And, this kind of natural force, the keening,
keening gloom, yeah,
it's that right here,
right? It's the massive ethereal cyclone, correct?
So that seems to be a non-personified threat,
correct,
to the city.
That's right.
And was that a deliberate choice in the face of dealing with the nature of evil and fantasy and things like that?
Yeah, so for instance, Indian mythology makes it very complex, right? Often a Rakshasa, right? It's a mythological creature in Hindu and Indian, lore and texts and fiction, and they're often portrayed as evil, but a lot of them are also good, and sometimes side with heroes, and can be defined against other evil Rakshasas, and I kind of love that in that it doesn't paint an entire race as evil or entire group as evil. And in the Radiant Citadel, you'll notice that like I really avoided evil, and I said people have different agendas and complexities, and I really leaned heavily on things being good in the Radiant Citadel. I think of it as a fragile utopia, and I set it up for three reasons for that. The first one is in D&D. Almost every city that's been written, there's a thieves guild. You could get mugged. There's like monsters lurking under the sewers. There's 20 problems, right? That's been done a lot of times, and I love the cities that have been built out that way. There's some really great and a lot of flavor, but it's been done a lot. And D&D is at 50 years of that, and I didn't want to necessarily contribute or repeat. I didn't want to be repetitive and kind of repeat the same things. So I thought about it and was like, what would be a great home base? How do you make something that is, between adventures and you just want to come back and have good role play? There are three core pillars that Jeremy Crawford and Chris Perkins talk about D&D, and combat's one of them, but the other two are exploration and social role play. And those are not as often like explored, but the Radiant Citadel gives you opportunities to explore, but to play with both of those pillars. So the first one is like, you think of it in a video game, right? You're the home base in the video game or the place where you restore, then you go out on an adventure. In many ways, the Radiant Citadel is that. The second is the concept of, it's a fragile utopia that takes work to maintain. It is not like, it's just not going to be automatically going well. And I wrote hints of that. I didn't go deep into it because I have a limited, space in the book to write about this. And so I'm not going to, and I think people get bored with, hundreds of pages of lore, at least I do. And so I hinted that it takes work to keep this society going. And hopefully a good DM will play with that and have the PCs get involved in the political drama and the social drama in the city. It is a struggle, and it does take work to keep the society at the Radiant Citadel functioning and positive for everybody.
So George says, basically, D&D and gaming has taken an orc that was a demon or ogre-like creature in early literature and changed them into a race of, I would say, human-like creatures. I would say that is what has happened. If your villain does not have these things, you have a monster, an unthinkable creature. Nico says, here's a big misunderstanding from Egypt. In Tolkien's story, the human heart is Middle Earth. The orcs and the elves are part of the heart. Oh! Very interesting, Nico. Very interesting. Nico, 100% agree. He was also supportive of the subjective interpretation of the reader. Some people saw a Christian allegory. Some people saw World War I. He loved that. And it reinforced the idea that he didn't write an allegory. See, so what you're talking about right here, I don't know how I want to say that right here, but that waging of conflict externally, or in a story when you're actually seeing a conflict waged externally, which is actually talking about how to wage a conflict that is waged internally, I think is really important. Because I think I talked to Cameron about that, because I was like, well, now, wait a minute. I think I specifically talked about waging an internal conflict externally by having good and evil in the story. So I'm not opposed to that. I like that kind of storytelling. I like a variety of different kinds of storytelling. But yeah, that's kind of the thing. You take these internal processes and then you take them out and you put them into an external world, and you have them argue things, fight things out, whatever, physically in an external world. All right, let's keep going.
This utopia isn't taken for granted, and I think it's timely in that, our we look at our country, or we look at our world, and often people take it for granted that like everything is just going to continue to function okay. And I want to make the argument that we have to be part of society, and we have to be an active part of society to continue to have a great country and a great world, and that we need to work collaboratively with each other to do so. I think the final thing is, and if you really want a big bad out there, right, is it's a utopia worth fighting for. So if you want to have like the evil like armies, like a lich or like a chromatic dragon come out and attack it, then you hopefully players will love this place so much when the DM throws like a big existential threat, whether it's a non-evil threat, like the Kingdom Gloom is more like an environmental threat or a mysterious threat, right? It does not seem to have a mind of its own, or if it does, people don't understand it. Right? It's an incomprehensible threat, or a very comprehensible threat of like like a half couple major chromatic dragons, ancient red dragon, or a flight of like blue dragons coming out and attacking it. Hopefully they will love the city enough to say this is worth fighting for, and I want to protect this place because I love being here, and this is my home. And so those are the three different like pillars that I thought about when I built the Radiant Citadel.
All right. Well, where do we go from there? When I was thinking about specifically like the nature of orcishness, we've had this discussion with different people. We have this idea, because I'm just talking this with myself. We've got this. We're very aware, obviously, in our society and our culture today, that we don't want to. If we're going to have an evil force in the world, we don't want to accidentally, deliberately, but certainly not deliberately, but not accidentally either. Accidentally say, well, we've just imported a whole bunch of elements from an existing culture in our world. And today, in 2020, we're aware of that.
Yeah,
and that seems to be a lot about what people talk about. But to me, that's also kind of a third order question that, the first order question would be, is there objective evil? And you could talk about that, whether or not you believe that in our world, but you could also talk about that in the context of a fantasy world that you're building. Is there objective evil? Second order question, does that evil manifest, physically? And then if it does, then you've got the third order question about like, well, what kind of physical characteristics should it have, or something like that?
Yeah.
Is it a wraith, or is it an orc, or is it something like that? So you said that in Indian mythology, you don't have. You talked about different things that could be evil, but they might ally with humanity, or back and forth and stuff.
Yeah.
Do they have an objective evil that objective? Do they have objective evil, and then do they have it manifest?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful about answering that, because I think different people have different like perspectives on that. I would say that like certainly. It's not clear cut, right? Ravana, which is a Rakshasa lord, and he was very important, also paid respect to Shiva, one of the good gods, or one of the gods that were one of the most important gods in Hindu mythology. And he was a very strong follower of Shiva, and it's wild because he's also like one of the main villains in Hindu mythology. And so that's a huge contradiction, right? Like, this villain is actually paying incredible respect to what is a heroic godlike figure, and that makes it very complex. And I actually find that complexity very interesting. To focus just on D&D worlds, right? Like, I think it is interesting to have objectively evil things, but I think that they're most interesting when they're not like humans in general, but more like the actions of human being, maybe trigger that, right? So like, I'm not crazy about like an entire race being evil, but I don't mind like an individual going, hey, I am so greedy and so hungry for power and so fearful for death. I will sacrifice anything and everyone for that power. And in that pathway towards this monstrous descent, they turn into a lich. And then a lich is objectively evil, right? Like, that individual thing is evil, but that's an individual choice by a humanoid to make consciously that choice, as opposed to like an entire race. I'm also okay with the idea of like deity or demonic figures being quite evil, and then getting a following. But I think that following should be a mixed group of people, not like all orcs, but like like you can have a god of like defilement or something like that, right? And say that god of defilement draws a group of followers for some that speaks to something inside of each of those individual followers that desires it. Maybe it's fear, maybe it's hunger for power, maybe it's envy, lots of different things that might make them follow it. And I think that's much more interesting. And I think you have a much richer campaign and story than being like, oh, all orcs are just now following this god of development, right? What is it? Then
JDM says, isn't that most storytelling, though, illustrating the struggle within us as characters that seem without us to make the struggle clearer? Well, you say most. You didn't say all. You said most. Is that most storytelling? Because it's not all storytelling. It's a particular type of storytelling. One that I happen to like personally. Is it most storytelling? I would have to figure out whether or not it's most storytelling or not, because this particular style of storytelling that I'm talking about here typically does not deal with well-rounded characters, and I've talked with people about that before. It tends to be a mode of storytelling that I tend to like, but it does mean that you tend to not have well-rounded characters, because each character, when they show up, has to represent a certain thing. And, when they're on screen, or when they're in the scene in a book or something like that, they have to represent, they bring their side of things. And that's what they are supposed to be doing. So I was just sitting here thinking as I was painting. So it's interesting thinking about the original Star Trek crew, when you're talking about Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and you've got Spock. He brings logic. Spock brings logic. Spock brings logic. McCoy brings emotion. McCoy brings emotion. When Spock is on screen, he's going to be bringing the logical side of things. When McCoy is on screen, he's going to be bringing the emotional side of things. When Captain Kirk is on screen, he is bringing bravado, right? He is bringing the bravado side of things. And then they fight this out in the conference room about how they're supposed to they're given some kind of situation, and then emotion, logic, and bravado fight this out on screen, right? But that means that Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are not well-rounded characters. Like, somebody would go, no, wait a minute. McCoy is always emotion. Like, shouldn't he be more well-rounded? According to one style of storytelling, maybe, but according to this particular style of storytelling, no. Like, I've only got so much time when I need to have the emotional response or the emotional side of a particular issue given. That's when McCoy walks into the conference room and he starts talking. Likewise, so I don't have time to make him something more complicated. He has to bring that every time that he's on screen. Likewise, Spock has to bring the logic side of things, and Kirk is always bringing bravado. You get muddied if you're like, no, wait a minute, all of them need to be all of those things in different, like, that muddies things. You've got a specific type of what is that? Heart, brain, and spleen. Sometimes emotion, logic, and bravado in storytelling are referred to as heart, brain, and spleen. And those are what those characters are supposed to bring. I don't know if it is most, but it is certainly a style. And one that I appreciate. I appreciate different kinds of storytelling, but I do really appreciate that storytelling as well. Let's see. Oh, lots of comments, lots of commentary. Oh, by the way, the minis looking great. Yeah, I'm happy with this is the human, or not the human, the hero elf that was in the elf quest pack. And I'm really happy with the way that this elf is looking. So that one's coming out well. Let's see. JDM says, interesting. I don't really write a lot of history papers, LOL. Not a writer of stories. I'm learning a lot tonight. Cool. All right, let's keep going.
You've got like this incredible storytelling, because you kind of end the story when you say like all orcs are evil. It once again is when we talk about flattening characters into one-dimensional. This is once again flattening into one-dimensional. And you stop asking questions at that point. You're just like, well, they're all evil. That's right.
I guess I completely disagree with that statement right there. I guess that goes completely counter to what I was just saying. Just because you're saying that all orcs are evil is not the end of storytelling. That does not. I don't think that is true at all. It would be the same thing as saying that McCoy is emotion. It's the fact that McCoy always represents emotion when he's on board the Starship Enterprise in that form of storytelling. Does that mean that's the end of storytelling? No, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. Because we're talking about watching an internal conflict play out externally through the characters. So I disagree with Ajit here.
Then I think like a variety of adventures is just like, what? Hey, these like, why is this like God, like? Why are these like weird, all of these followers from different like walks of life? You've got a merchant there that's following this god, this evil god, and you've got like a princess that's following this evil god, and you've got like this orc warrior that was once a hero that's now following this evil god, and like what brought them together? I think there's the story potential blows up when you ask those questions.
Well, that's an interesting way to go. Lou and I talked about evil being something that you do. So that's one potential way to go. You could say that, yes, there is objective evil in the world, and but the way that it manifests is only through actions and what particular actions people choose to take.
Yeah, I agree with that philosophically. I think that the evil is the actions that you do. That is not that you're inherently evil. I mean, as a person, that's how I think about it. I think in D&D, I think it's okay to have like non-humanoid, races, like a demon, right, or a god-like figure, or a dragon be evil. I'm okay with that, right? Those are very far from real life things. But once you say like humanoid races becoming pure evil, that becomes a little bit different. I think where I like larger than life entities, like gods or demons or whatever being evil, is that they are detached. They're almost like forces of nature. It's like if you gave the Keening Gloom, if you did decide it had a mind of its own, then that would be like, great. It is this super massive ethereal cyclone is evil, and it's a force of nature, and it's almost incomprehensible, and its evil is incomprehensible. And that's I think that's a viable and potential story element if you want to embrace
that. Yeah, I've been thinking about say, assuming that you do believe in objective evil, which I'm not even sure that I do. Let's just say that you do. You know, it's not my personal philosophy. Let's say that you believe in objective evil. Then something that you wouldn't want to do is to demonize human things. That would be something that would be bad. And so I think in our history of like understanding, for instance, Orcishness, the development of Orcishness, we've added more and more humanity toward orcs, you know, as we've gone. But if you are a person who believes in evil, then the reverse should also be true. You don't want to humanize the demonic. That would also be something that you wouldn't want to do.
Yeah, I guess if you believe in evil and you think about it that way, you wouldn't want to. Yeah, I think not humanizing it and say that it's some kind of supernatural force is probably a better way to talk about it. And then you can say that people do evil deeds, but it is some kind of external force is an interesting way of looking at it for sure.
I was thinking about this. I haven't mentioned this on camera yet, but I was thinking about this from the Christian perspective because I'm here in rural Alabama, and I am not the Protestant Christian in my thinking, but my family certainly has been. And so we're talking about growing up with D&D and things like that. I had one of the Merc books, which is the Middle Earth role-playing books that specifically talked about how the orcs, you know, and that's in the context of Middle Earth. You know, I was talking about the Middle Earth orcs specifically. And it was saying that they worship the darkness. And boy, that was just a huge thing in my
I'm sure.
This book has got to get out of here. You know, this book is evil. You know, we are out of here. And now I've thought about this in two different ways. I've thought that, well, from a Christian perspective, and especially when you think about the book of Revelation, you think about what is, you know, Christ's response to evil. It's a combative nature that, you know, there is evil. And what is the response to evil? Combative response to evil. And so you could play a game or tell a story where you can say, okay, there is evil. It's those orcs over there. What's the proper response for good people? A combative nature.
Yeah.
And you could say, look, Dad, but the book, you know, is teaching that story, that this is a story about heroes who are supposed to be combative against nature when they, you know, evil when they realize it. But that was not something that was recognized. There's so many different layers here because that's not something that was recognized within the household. You know, the presence of that statement that orcs worship darkness means this book has got to get out of here. And that, you know, then I can think, well, gee, would it be worse if we said those orcs, you know, really they aren't all that evil. They could be really good too, and let's humanize them. Would that be worse in a philosophy when you're talking about, you know, the presence of evil?
So there's an interesting question because Christianity also says that, you know, all sinners can be redeemed if they repent, right? You know, and if they convert, you know, and I think in theory, like a community, my thing is always community response. I'm a strong believer in community and collaboration, and I think.
See, I think this is a misunderstanding with this point. I've been thinking about this, that when you think about now, I have not studied every encounter like, you know, with Jesus and evil in the Bible. So maybe there are some things that are still instructive to learn. But when I'm thinking about it, I'm saying, what is the proper response to evil? I am thinking it's a combative nature, according to like a Christian tradition. Okay, but the counter to that is often something like what Ajit is saying, that, well, you know, human beings can be redeemed, and you try to, you know, talk people, but that's a misunderstanding of the of evil and humanity. That's a misassociation between a human being who is currently fallen into sin, who can therefore be turned back around and repent, and evil itself. Like, what do we get when Christ confronts evil? I'm not talking about confronting a person who has fallen into sin, because that's what I was talking about. You would not want to demonize a human being, because the human being can still be returned from sin and be saved. But if you're encountering evil, that's not something that can be turned around. Like I'm thinking about when Christ is exorcising the person who has been possessed and he's casting the demons into pigs. He doesn't try to repent those demons. He doesn't try to fix those demons. He doesn't try to get those demons to stop doing what they're doing and come back to the good side. He exorcises them, throws them into puts them into the pigs, and they fling themselves off the cliff. That's a very combative nature toward evil. So there's a distinction in my mind, at least, between a human who has fallen into sin and something that is demonic. And so that's why I say you wouldn't want to demonize a human, right? Because that human has the potential to return from sin. But likewise, you would not want to humanize something that is demonic, because that is the demonic thing does not have that expression. It is evil. You don't go make the demon a sandwich and hope that it gets better and returns to heaven, because that's not something it's going to do. Nico says, here's an interesting point from Ajit. Evil in gods and heroes is acceptable, but not race. What does race represent? Is there something evil inherent to all humans regardless? Is hate natural? So evil in gods and heroes is acceptable, but not race. What does race represent? I'll have to think about that. James says, in Christianity, redemption comes through belief in Christ, not from other humans. Isn't your job to confront or forgive evil? Well, it's not your job to confront. It's you don't forgive evil. It's not when you encounter it, you're not supposed to confront it. Yeah, what is your responsibility toward evil? You're not. So I'm not sure that the forgiveness of evil is one thing, but what is your relationship with evil? I'm not sure that that's a general Christian thing. Because I specifically get the combat when I went through the confirmation in the Episcopal Church. We specifically talked about a combative nature toward evil. So yeah, I think at least some Christian denominations would talk about would definitely think that your response or an appropriate response to evil is something that is combative or confrontational.
In the U.S., we've strangely gravitated towards more of this individualism, and that the myth of the individual triumphing against all odds. And nothing about our history actually shows that's really what happened, right? It's communal efforts and large groups of people working together, first to establish their country, then to send out the British, or to lead a revolution against the British, and then continue to build the country. It is communities that do it. And one could argue that a communal effort in the face of evil might actually make evil people change their minds. And maybe they can be, maybe they will join this community and change their ways. If Christianity is a religion of love, and embraces those themes, I think, one avenue obviously is to fight, but I do think the other avenue is to find ways to get us to a better place. That's just sort of, I'm not Christian. This is sort of my thinking. I mean, I grew up Christian, but I'm not currently. But I just was playing a little bit of a opposing ideas.
I completely. I think that's great, because like I said, I'm not a Christian either, but I grew up in that kind of thinking. But the thing that I would say there, that to counter that though, is to say that there would be a difference, especially when I'm thinking about my father was an Anglican priest and my grandfather is a Southern Baptist minister, and they would definitely draw a distinction between a human, that you could talk back like you're talking about, but then also from Lucifer and his demons, that you're not trying to, that there is no hope of redeeming that demon. And so when you encounter that demon, you're encountering evil, and the appropriate thing is to fight.
Yeah.
And if you're saying that, then you have to ask for your world. Is the orc representing some type of human, but also the derivation of the word orc comes from demon. So you could just say the orc, you're talking about a demon.
Yeah. And I guess if it's you're just actually talking about a demon, that would make sense. I think a lot of portrayals of orcs have had implications that they are, it feels like it is, non-white races that are adversarial to Western European races, and that does feel like it is an analogy for Western European conquering or overthrowing of non-white races. And it does go back to the history of how non-white races are often portrayed in white media. They flattened out one, to one-dimensional, the big thug or the villain who's going to steal like a woman or whatever that portrayal is. And there's a lot of ugly portrayals over the years. Yeah. I would say there's a strong argument that like orcs can fit into that. And so it just depends, I guess, on how you look.
All right. Would you like to cover some metaphysical ground?
Sure. Always.
Well, we're going to Mark Tassin here. Scott says, yeah, see, but we humans do demonize the enemy. Yes, we do all the time. Mythological demons and monsters are stands-in for the others, the enemy. And then we later adopted to temptation with our own hearts. Yeah, well, that's exactly. And what I was talking about with calling Russian soldiers orcs. Like, I think that's fascinating because there's an classic example right there where we are trying to demonize the enemy. What are Russians? Orcs, something demonic, something other than human. That's why when they're killed on the battlefield in Ukraine, we shouldn't feel bad about it, or why we can kill them on the battlefield and without compunction. So yeah, no, it's true. It's true that we do absolutely demonize the enemy often. So I think that's also something that should be written about. JDM says this is a debate between faith alone and faith and works. James Bacon says, you don't want to let evil hang out. When I said isn't your job to confront evil, what I meant specifically and singularly is that it isn't your job to question its nature. Oh, okay. Well, that to me, those are different things. Yeah. JDM says, I see, I guess. Interesting concept to think about. I was raised Catholic church. We were taught to avoid evil things, but not necessarily to seek it out and combat it. Okay, let's keep going.
Happy to cover metaphysical ground.
All right. Well, one of the topics that I'm covering here on the channel, and I've got one video out on it, but I've got some others that I'm editing that are coming out.
Yeah.
Is on the philosophy of orcishness. Now, that can definitely be a very geeky topic right there.
Yeah.
But I would say, so in Ataltis, is there objective evil? Are there orcs? How are you handling that? What's the relationship between the characters and objective evil, if there is such thing, or is there nothing like that?
No, so that's something that was really important to me to look at, because I think that most folks watching will probably be aware of some of the concerns around like the orcs and things like that, being basically racial parodies and having some pretty harmful ideas behind them. One of the things that I wanted, however, is I do
see, again, we are back to this idea of when we were trying to discuss the subject, we're back to the idea of racial representation in the modern world, like by what our modern standard of races are, which comes up a lot when I'm discussing this with people, which, like, I think, like I said, my opinion, that can be talked about in 2 sentences. Oh, if you want to have a story where you're dealing with the demoniacal, and actually confronting evil directly, hey, make sure that what you're doing doesn't accidentally or intentionally use some actual human group as a template for the demonic. Okay, don't do that. Okay, got that. Okay, we can say that in 2 sentences. Now let's get on to me, the bigger questions about the nature of evil and what we're saying. But in today's world, a lot of people want to spend a lot of time on, hey, making sure that we don't have a representation. We don't accidentally use that human group as something that's evil. That's what people want to talk about, which is interesting to me, which I think is interesting part of the conversation. That when you want to talk about evil, what do people talk about? Oh, I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally using a real life world human race on Earth as my template for something that's evil. That's what people want to talk about. Scott says, psychologically, it may be necessary to demonize the enemy, ultimately for sake of survival. If you can sympathize with those who are trying to kill you, it's hard to defend yourself and fight back. Well, that's interesting. We'll have to talk about that later. I have a story about Russians and Ukrainians who are my friends. Can't be told here in 200 character segments, but another time I should tell their experiences. That sounds interesting. At this point from Ajit is also very interesting, and he's not entirely wrong. In mythology, the stranger is represented with exaggerated characteristics, weird colors, many limbs. This is not arbitrary. James says, if you think that a fantasy orc is representing a specific real-world racial experience, isn't it you who is bringing those racialized ideas into the game? Do they even exist without you? Good questions. Good questions. Nico says, the reason is that these characteristics represent the unity with the listener. The stranger is not part of the tribe, has different beliefs, languages, etc. How does one relate to the stranger? JDM says, I think the change from race to species could solve a lot of these problems. Race is such a loaded word today. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with using other words too, like ancestry. I actually, I like for Rabivania, species would be the word. For I think for theophany, I would use ancestry because some of these things to make more sense. It's not always like the fantasy conceptualization of race is not exactly species. It could be, but it's not exactly species. I think. See, to me, I don't have a problem with the word because when I understand what a race is in a fantasy context. But other people don't. Maybe the word is just so loaded today that you just have to get rid of it because people don't understand that level of nuance. Joseph Carter says, don't use a human group as a template for evil. Okay, so I created this green-skinned monster as my template for evil, and someone decided that it was human. Oh. Well, that's what I was saying. In a magical, mythic world where any species can mate with anything, and isn't 5th edition or something like that, or the 1D&D talking specifically about how all races, or whatever they're called, how all races can have children with all other races, and how you handle that. In a magical, mythic world where everything can mate with anything, species don't mean much. It's all races, more closely related to hereditary groups. I don't word choice does anything.
Like this idea in our own world, it's never cut and dried what's right and wrong, right? It's very hard sometimes to really, I shouldn't say never, but it can be complicated. Even if you know what's right and wrong, the motivations behind it can make it complicated. At the game table, it's nice to have some clarity. And I think that it's important to have a clear foe that you're out to fight. It's kind of like in Space Invaders, the aliens coming down, you don't really think much about. If anyone knows what Space Invaders is, I've just aged myself, but the reality is that in a video game, you've got enemies that you're fighting, and you don't spend a lot of time thinking about what's motivating the enemy. It's an escape, and so I wanted to have that in this world. And so there are orcs, goblins, trolls, and they are evil. But what's important, and this is where I talk about reimagining how things work, the important part is that there is a dark god named Androran who wanted to take his vengeance upon his brothers and sisters who cast him out. He gave magic to the people of the world, and they were not amused, and so they cast him out. And so to create his revenge, he wanted to create something evil to wreck everything that they built, because he embraced the dark powers, he embraced the evil, let his anger get the best of him, and was like, yeah, I want to make something. But unfortunately, he couldn't make these things himself. He couldn't make true life. But what he could do is create parodies of life. And orcs, for example, are a dark mirror of dwarves. They're the worst aspects of dwarves brought to life.
That's right. I remember that they're the mirror of dwarves, not elves.
They are, right? And exactly.
I thought that was interesting. Yes.
Yeah, and for example, goblins are the dark version of halflings. They don't even really build their own cultures. Their cultures are parodies of the cultures that were built by these different lineages during the early days of the world. And so what you have are these creatures that are designed for one reason only, and that's destruction. They aren't beautiful creatures. They don't have the potential to change. They are, unfortunately, just living weapons effectively. However, you also have creatures like kobolds and gnolls, which are half human, half animal. These creatures were created when the cataclysm destroyed the gates. Humans and a number of the different lineages are from a different world. They came through to Aetaltis and were trapped there when their gates were destroyed, but it melded creatures together. And you ended up with things like minotaurs and goblins. I mean, minotaurs and kobolds and gnolls. These creatures aren't necessarily evil. These creatures are creatures that are often cast out. They often live on the edges of society. They're often treated badly because people don't have a high opinion of them. And at times people find them to be repulsive by their own definitions of beauty. And so they may behave in ways that are unpleasant and dark, but they aren't necessarily dark in and of themselves. And so that gives you a space to have that moral grayness on which way you want to go. And then in between, you've got opportunities for people to make dark choices, to lead themselves down the path of darkness to the point where it consumes them and they cease to exist and become that dark mirror of themselves. You've got all these sort of shades in between, but I wanted to have a very clear sense of, well, we know it's okay to fight these folks. We know that if we don't fight them, it will mean the end of life as we know it. They're just like a storm or a disease or something like that. At some point, you have to destroy them. And they represent mirrors of the other lineages. So they aren't like their own lineage that, has been demonized along the way.
I think that is, of course, there are multiple different types of storytelling.
Yeah.
But I think that's a completely valid type of storytelling, because what I do is I recognize different types of stories that are going on. And in storytelling of a certain type of that, like, I have no problem with that. Other people on the internet obviously have different opinions, but I don't have any problem with that as a certain type of storytelling, because I've made the argument in others before that, like if your PCs all of a sudden look over the ravine or something like that, and they see some elves all of a sudden being beaten up by orcs. Like, now is not the time for a major discussion among the PCs about what is right or what is wrong or what. It's just, that's the game master telling you, go fight the orcs. You had some good guys, you had some bad guys, go jump in and be a hero and help, fight the orcs, help the elves.
Yeah. But I think that one of the challenges, though, is that there was the use of some of these monster species as a way to sort of represent sideways, whether or not it was even fully cognizant. It was a sideways representation, especially when all of the other heroes in the world were clearly white people, right? So the truth is that you have to think about it, whether or not you believe that having a villain as a storytelling foil is okay, a bad person who you can only defeat. The reality is that we do have a responsibility to think about how we're including them within the world, which is why we spend a lot of time saying, how do we include this while making sure that we're not just repeating the same mistakes over again? I believe that we've been successful in what we've done, but that's going to be up to other folks to tell us. And I think that we have a responsibility to, think through those sorts of decisions, because as much as I love the idea of like, yeah, I'm going to go kill some orcs, I need to think about, what those orcs represent in my world.
Yeah, because they could, right. We've been talking about like the representation of the demonic, versus the representation of some type of aspect of humanity, and those are very different things.
And what I wanted is, I wanted this to be a fight against the dark parts of themselves. We all have to face the parts of ourselves we don't like, the parts of ourselves that are greedy or angry or violent or well up inside of us. Every human being has to deal with that. And that's what I wanted the orcs and the goblins and the trolls to be, is I wanted them to be that when a dwarf faces off with an orc, the dwarf is facing off with the darkest aspects of themselves, and they are overcoming it in a physical conflict. And, that's the sort of idea that I wanted to create.
Well, that sounds like wasn't that the George R. R. Martin? Was it George R. R. Martin who said this originally or not? I don't know, but I'm connecting with him that the division between good and evil. That's the Solzhenitsyn thing. That's the Solzhenitsyn. This is Solzhenitsyn. We'll keep going. But this is Solzhenitsyn,
every human heart.
I think that aspect is present in what he does. I think he said that, whether or not he was the originator of the idea or not. But that's a different way to go.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with potential redemption of orcs or the potential fall of elves or those things, that's a different type of storytelling.
Yeah.
You're going a different direction. And I personally, I think that when you're critiquing these things, which you are rightly doing, sometimes people will critique them. You've got a particular type of storytelling, and then you're critiquing it according to a different type of storytelling. And you're crossing the genres, and you're like, okay, well, you're not supposed to be doing that. But in the context of this is what we're looking at. In the context of this is what we're looking at. And they should be evaluated in sort of their own context. Is kind of the way that I'm thinking about it. Okay, so on this channel, I've done a series of videos on the philosophy of Orcishness, and I suppose in some ways you can't get much more geeky than that as far as diving into Orcishness and figuring it out. But I actually think that it has some important things to say about what we discuss as a society and fantasy, and I think that you may have some important insight into that. So one of the first things that I did, and this is on the channel and so on playlist, where I went through and I documented the history of the development of orcs from pre-Tolkien all the way through Tolkien and then up until the present day.
And Tolkien changed and evolved how he understood them in his own writings. So
yes, as far as I was able to find within his own writing, yes, they changed and evolved. Yes, but you've got the Celtic tradition, which there isn't that I was able to find.
Where does the word come from? I'm not familiar with the origin of the word pre-Tolkien. What is this?
It actually comes from the word, if I can remember from what I had put in all of these videos, I was looking for a connection between orc and the demonic, and it's actually extremely direct linguistically. That you've got orc, you've got orcus, this word that's associated with the underworld. And so in also, I believe it's Beowulf, you have the direct connection between this word orc and its translation later as demon. So we've got
orc coming into Norwegian, Scandinavian storytelling in Beowulf 1,000 years ago.
Right. And this was a word that was adopted and brought in by Tolkien, and it became his orcs. And then now it's become everything else that it has become. And, from World of Warcraft and all of this. And one of the things, when I was done writing this, like this history of Orcishness and trying to understand orcs, like, for instance, from Demon, like we were just talking about, all the way through, there was this thing that happened in Dungeons and Dragons rather recently, that their alignment as evil had been removed. That they're no longer something.
Are they neutral?
Right. Well, the statement is something like this, and this is not an exact quote, but very close. That they removed any type of like racial evilness from the orcs by saying that they are just as capable of choosing their own paths as anybody else. They're good and evil just as humans are.
Which is because that's how Muslims see the jinn. By the way, we see the jinn as the parallel people often say is jinn are like the demons of Christianity. They're not, because there can be demonic jinn. There can be jinn that are evil and malevolent, and there are jinn that are good and they worship God and they do righteousness, right? The range of free will exists within that entity in that tradition, right? Whereas I think most Christians consider you're either an angel or demon, or you've made that choice and you went from angel to demon. So what's interesting that you say that, Heath, is my own, and you probably have much more knowledge because you look into it, my own understanding of the orc evil conundrum out of Tolkien is I've read some scholarly articles about the Silmarillion, whatever, before sort of the postmodern scholarship on Tolkien, the traditional scholarship, looking at his material rather than projecting onto it political ideologies that have come later. But if some of the early...
This actually makes me want to have more discussions with other people specifically on this subject. I'm thinking of some different people that I could invite on, because I'm getting close to having these miniatures done. Oh, by the way, check out, like I really thought that I completely ruined this a weapons rack, but I kind of fixed it here in the last few minutes. So I think that's
reasonable. Like I said, I'm just going for tabletop quality. I think that's a reasonable tabletop quality now, so I brought it back. I'm getting close to done with these, so I'm not going to need to do quite as many Crafter's Corner, although I've got some other things I've got to paint because I want to be able to paint other to do other games as well. But as I move into being able to do some more board game streaming with these painting, I want to be able to do some more live table talks. I want to bring Lou back on. Carrie Smith. Does anyone know Carrie Smith? I would like to have Carrie Smith on. She might be an interesting one to talk about the nature of good and evil in storytelling today. I don't know her. I just have to invite her. And likewise, there is, the ladies from the Force of Light. The Force of Light. One of them is doing a PhD in theology. She might be interesting to talk to on this subject. I just have to reach out. I'm not really connected to very many people, so I don't get a whole lot of responses. But there's a lot more. I think there's a lot more to be said on this subject. JDM says, "Oh, I've seen Cameron on Overlord DVD. Yeah, he used to be on there quite a bit. He hasn't been on there quite so much, maybe in the last year or more. But he used to be on there. I used to watch him there too." It's interesting that even Leto Atreides commented the soldiers know that the Atreides are benevolent and good because they are effective with their propaganda campaign. I would also like to talk to Matt Colville. Yeah, I don't know him personally or anything like that, but I would like to. He might be also a great person to talk to on a variety of different levels. So maybe I'll take a little bit of time to try to reach out to some people. I tend to try to think of these things in terms of seasons. So like do another round of 10 discussions. Thank you, Joseph. Oh, though James says the weapons look great, and then the weapon right looks great, at least as I can do. So seriously, definitely good enough for the table. Thank you. So that's what I'm going for. Thank you.
Scholarship was talking about the nature of, did Tolkien believe the orcs had free will? Now we understand as the mythology developed that eventually Tolkien identified the orcs as descendants of corrupted elves. They were elves that were stolen by Morgoth, the force of evil, the Satan in his world, of whom Sauron is just a servant, and were taken and were tortured and were abused psychologically, physically, and turned almost into animals, and then forced to breed with each other, like in a breeding experiment. And then the orcs are essentially these devolved form of elves. That's the mythology as I understand it. And I read one scholar suggested that Tolkien believed that the environment in which these orcs were incubated and forcibly bred, right? And multiple generations of the abuse, the cycle of abuse, because they're physically bred in this environment, they almost like animals, they can't escape it, that their elven and their, inherent conscience has been suppressed, just like any abused child. If you're living in a system where you're being raised like an animal and the whole system is that, your humanity is stripped away early on, and then you are dehumanized. But that the idea is that Tolkien believed that in theory, an orc could break free of that, but it's and reestablish their Eru created. Eru is the god of the of the Tolkien world. Eru and Luvatar, the Eru created nature that the elves were given. He could return to that. An orc could return to that, but it's really, really hard because they've essentially been beaten, tortured, and brainwashed and treated like animals from birth. So it's extremely hard to break free, but it's possible. That's my understanding from that scholar's article. I don't know that how that jives with what you've learned.
Well, and I think that is one of the things that does change within Tolkien itself, like his attitude exactly toward the orcs. There is some shifting throughout the decades and the writing, Okay. But so what I was trying to get at, or what I realized as I was writing this, is that, okay, if we start off with this idea of the orc as demon, and then we end up with this idea today as an orc as, let's use the term person. Okay. Because, obviously in today's world, we are hyper aware of making sure that something like an orc in a story doesn't stereotype some particular race or culture or something.
Because we're projecting human ethnic issues onto this fantasy creation. Yeah. Yes.
And we're very aware of that. And so we don't want to do that. Now, but I suppose that my concern with that is that that's what we talk about when we talk about orcishness. It seems like when I was talking to other authors about that.
But I was actually more interested in what that says about our society's relationship with the demonic, because it seems like we have progressed the orc. So, it's very important, if you believe in demons or the demonic, that you wouldn't ever want to demonize a human. That humans and demons are different from one another. You don't want to
ontologically, and with regard to the origin story of demons being fallen angels, that they made one choice. Human beings have free will every second of the way, right? I don't know whether in Christian theology a demon can repent. I don't generally hear that concept.
It seems like no, from the people who.
It seems like it's once you made the choice to go down this path, it forever will dominate your destiny, like the Sith.
But that as a human, the choice is still there.
Yeah,
so
you can repent every moment.
Never want to
change any moment you want.
A human as something demonic, because the human can change.
Correct, because the human has the ability to regain, to regain the light, to regain relationship with God at any moment. Yes.
Whereas ontologically, a demon would not. So you wouldn't want to demonize humans. And we hear that even sort of just today, don't demonize that person or something like that. But, if you think about actually what you're talking about, if you believe in demons, if you have it, or even if you don't, what the demonic means, you don't want to demonize people. But I think that the reverse would also be true, that if you're not supposed to demonize humans, you wouldn't want to humanize demons, that you wouldn't want to humanize the demonic. And so if the orc was a representation of the demonic, and that is something about our attitude toward something that tells us what our attitude toward the demonic should be, which is typically a combative attitude, it seems. Sure. If you're a hero, because it's not easy to be combative towards something demonic. But somebody like Aragorn or, other great heroes, one of the reasons they're heroes is because they can be combative toward demons. And, so they don't want to humanize the demon. Like, what do you do with the demon? You don't make it a sandwich.
You can try to. I mean, there's horror movies where the person thinks he can reach the demon and the demon just destroys.
That was not the correct response to the demon.
Yeah, they'll always betray you, kind of thing. Yes.
So I was wondering, as I read, going from orc, through people playing orcs in games and in World of Warcraft and stuff like that, as we have we actually humanized the demonic? And does that say something about what we think about evil as a society? Nico says, here Heath brings a really important point. By making the orc less ideal. Oh, wait, hold on. We got here. Heath, one important element of myth is distance. What's furthest from yourself is closer to the gods. The world of ideas, dreams, elves, and orcs are the earliest creatures. That's why they're ideal. Nico says, here Heath brings a really important point. By making the orc less ideal, we've removed one more way to relate to evil at its lay level. So we can tell less if a lay person is acting in an evil way. Oh. Yeah. I think I'm on to something here with the humanization of the demonic. I haven't specifically heard that. Doesn't mean that it isn't from someplace else, because, it's difficult to have an original idea. But I think this idea of our societal humanization of the demonic is something that we need to talk about and have a wider discussion about.
Well, that definitely says what we think about evil society. We're again a moment in culture where there is this and there's value to it and there's challenges to it. Where the idea is don't generalize, which I think is a fair statement amongst human beings. We've gone through historical periods of fighting the other, and my Crusades novel is all about that, about the Crusaders projecting all their sort of worst instincts onto their Muslim adversaries, and then actually encountering them and realizing that their understanding was just false. I mean, and that's more demoralizing than losing a battle, is that when you're fighting people like when the Crusaders encountered Saladin, who they've been told is this evil infidel tyrant, and he turns out to be this incredibly chivalrous noble man by their moral standards of chivalry. He's exceeding the chivalry that Richard the Lionheart is showing, who's killing women and children left and right, and Saladin is sending them presents in the middle of battle. Like in the middle of a battle, he would there was a wedding party happening in one of the Crusader camp while Saladin attacked, and in the middle of the battle he sent presents over to the wedding party and kept fighting, right? But that just came from his inherent nature of his chivalry, which is part of Islamic culture. It's called fatua, this kind of chivalry. There's a word for it, and that shattered that kind of dealing with an adversary that was noble by their moral standards and discovering that their projections onto their adversary were false demoralized the Crusaders more than anything else. It wasn't defeat in physical battle. It was just, who are we fighting? Right? My novel goes into that. I mean, are we the bad guys in the story? And that's the most demoralizing moment. So I think all that is healthy in dealing with human beings. So now we're looking at these mythological creations, right, that serve a purpose in the story. There is, to my knowledge, there is nothing in Tolkien, including in anything in his notes, of any orc that turned good. I don't know of any unpublished short story of the good orc that broke free. I don't think that exists, unless someone has undiscovered notes from Christopher Tolkien or whatever. I don't know. But he did, and he was also writing from a time period, where he did see the world as black and white. He came from, a British Christian background, and he had very strict things at the East, those Orientalist projections. The East is, the Easterlings were evil, but even then, even in his novels.
See, Scott Graham says, for someone who believes in embodied evil, demons and devils, humanizing demons represents a way in which Satan corrupts us. I would completely agree with this. That if you do have the spiritual outlook of a belief in demons and devils and all of that, and embodied evil like this, that one of the major reasons you would want to be on guard against humanizing a demon or a devil is because that would be something that Satan would want as far as his corruption goes. It's a matter of don't mistake true evil for ordinary humanity, right? That, hey, that sounds like something Satan would be saying, right? That, hey, we're no different from you. We're not, the demonic, that's propaganda or whatever. We're no different from you as a human.
Even in the Lord of the Rings, he acknowledges that the Easterlings who were fighting for Sauron had been lied to. So they weren't inherently evil.
And they were different. They were distinguished between them and the orcs. Again, that was
correct.
If the orcs were the demonic.
Correct.
Yeah.
Whereas the orcs. So here's my thought on the orcs. So part of the problem of in reinterpreting this mythology, which has no basis in the source material, to give these orcs this free will, it's our value judgment about their behavior that makes it uncomfortable. If we thought of orcs as a colony of bees or ants or other insects, they behave in ways that, some fire ants can be very physically dangerous human beings, can kill them, right? And have no problem doing so. And is that evil? Or they're just doing what is inherently programmed into them within their nature. We watch a movie like Them, a classic movie from the 50s, one of my favorite movies from the era of like the nuclear Godzilla, and you have these, nuclear testing creates giant ants. Are the giant ants evil? They're definitely scary, and they're a threat to human beings, and they have to be destroyed. Are they evil? I don't know that they're evil. They're following their natural instincts as evolved creatures to survive and to eat. One would say that the orcs are exactly the same, right?
Well, at least that sounds like the 40K orcs that spring from spores. That sounds like exactly what they were going with the 40K orcs, right? JDM says, this is a deeper version of my perspective. Well, so wait, we had some controversy up here. Yeah, see, I mean, Nico said that, but demons and devils are not embodied except in myths, but I'm not worried about that with my analysis that I just gave. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. I don't happen to believe in actual demons and devils, but that doesn't necessarily mean I don't believe in evil. See, I'm still working through this through myself. But my concern, what I was trying to say is that if you do have that belief, then what are the consequences of those beliefs? I'm not trying to argue a truth value of that particular belief. I'm just trying to think through the ramifications of having that belief. JDM says, this is a deeper version of my perspective on orcs for my games. They're monsters. Translate monster as demon. Don't humanize them. Just play the game and kill them. Trend to humanize orcs reflects the zeitgeist understanding that evil is a matter of choice within ourselves, which makes embodied external evil concept a deception that can absolve us of responsibility. Wait, let me read that again. Trend to humanize orcs reflects the zeitgeist understanding that evil is a matter of choice within ourselves,
which makes embodied external evil concept a deception that can absolve us of responsibility. I'll think about that. All right, let's keep going. There isn't much more left here.
And so projecting onto them our concept of free will. Does an ant have free will? Does a bee have free will? I mean, they have a hive mind, and one is that immoral? Yeah, they have an instinct, and is that immoral? It can be dangerous. You have to destroy something that's a physical threat to you, but is it evil? I mean, I hate insects. I hate cockroaches in particular. I'm scared the hell out of them. Are they evil? They certainly feel like it to me when they come into my home, right? They're not evil. The spiders, they're not evil. They're following their instinct, which just happens to be you're the victim of that instinct. And so you got to defend yourself. And that is, I think, the more accurate way to think of these creatures, especially the orcs who are a bred race. They're not like Morgoth and the fallen Ainur, the sort of angelic beings that Morgoth led a rebellion against Eru the Crater, and Sauron and all these dark figures, followed him and took physical form. But they're essentially they're closer to demons because they made a choice. Whereas the orcs never had a choice. They're just following a programmed instinct that is a threat to the human race. But
that's interesting that demonic, you're associating that in order to be demonic, you need to have made the choice. That's something that does not have a choice.
Made a choice. Orcs never had a choice. And it's not in Tolkien's mythology, to my knowledge, the orcs ever had a choice. I mean, they didn't ask to be their ancestors didn't ask to be kidnapped elves from the woods, taken in and brutalized and horrifically tortured and scarred and physically changed with God knows what chemicals, and then forced to breed with each other like animals. They didn't ask for that, but that's what they got. And their kids didn't ask to be born that way, deformed and abused, but that's what they got. And they're now instinct. They're not evil, but they're a threat. They're an absolute threat that has to be stopped. A virus is not evil. A virus is just doing what it does, but it has to be stopped, as we've been through the last 2 years, or we're in trouble.
Well, that is an interesting, a very interesting take, I think, on the orcs. That if they don't have choice, which actually does come back to things like Satan and the fallen angels and things like that theologically, which I hope we will be able to get to. Oh, okay. So that was all that I put together for this conversation, and we've been going for quite a while here. Let's see, lots of stuff going on here in the comments. James says, man, I'd love to get on a Discord channel and actually discuss all this. Comments can be difficult to manage with the separate threads. We can do that in the Ravenkeep Discord server. That's fine. We just need a place for it. But, you can create threads within specific channels. So if you have a channel that looks like it would fit, but we can create a thread in there and talk about it, that'd be great. That'd be fine. All right. Well, I didn't quite get my miniatures finished, but I almost did. So I still have these swordsmen, which again, I'm not really sure that this is a great color scheme for them, but these are the evil elven swordsmen in this. And so that's very close. So it actually might be that I'll finish them this weekend. I might finish them this Sunday. Traditionally, Sunday is when we're supposed to be doing the Crafter's Corner, but I just had to do some more in order to actually get the stuff done. But actually, by Sunday, I might be able to get those finished, and then I might open up something else to work on because I might get those done earlier, because I've got the Advanced Hero Quest miniatures over there that I really want to finish as well. Because I want to play Advanced Hero Quest, but nobody will ever go play Advanced Hero Quest with me. Nobody will ever play it with me. So there's that. But then I will have some other digital assets that I've got to make before I start streaming board games. But maybe I can do that soon. But anyway, I thought this was a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate this conversation. Please do, if you've enjoyed it, please do like and subscribe. I thought this was great. I think these are important conversations to be had. And maybe we can continue to extend this. Maybe I'll invite some other people on who, and if you have recommendations, let me know, to do some more table talks, some one-on-one conversations about this. I think that would be really interesting, because it is a topic that I'm very interested in. And as you can tell from the kinds of storytelling that I do and the themes that I enjoy, demons, heaven, hell, angels, that kind of stuff, that happens to be something that comes up again and again in my writing. So it's a theme I'm also very interested in. So thank you so much for being here. Please do like, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. And hey, maybe just 1 second, I will copy. I just pasted the Discord, Ravenkeep Discord server link into the chat. So all right, everybody, I will see you in the morning. Oh my God, it's already 10:30. So 9:30 in the morning, we'll continue. We'll look at the monsters in Dark Sun. We'll take a look at the monsters in Dark Sun tomorrow. Bye, everybody. Have a wonderful